billionaire's wife dramatically interrupted his wedding to his mistress with shocking evidence. Their marriage was never legally over because his mistress was actually their adopted daughter, given up by his wife before they met. His attempt to start a new life revealed secrets that destroyed everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The gilded ballroom, moments before brimming with champagne flutes and celebratory laughter, now hung heavy with stunned silence. Julian Thorne, billionaire and groom-to-be, stood frozen, his meticulously crafted smile cracking like brittle porcelain. His intended bride, Veronica, a vision in white, stared at the woman who had just stormed the altar. Eleanor, Julian's estranged wife, a storm cloud in a tailored black suit. "This wedding is invalid, Julian." Eleanor's voice, though low, cut through the shocked hush. "Because Veronica is Isabel, our adopted daughter, given up for adoption 15 years ago." A gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Veronica, Isabel, paled, her eyes wide with a horrifying mix of shock and guilt. Julian's face contorted, a mixture of disbelief and fury warring on his features. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to control the narrative, but only a strangled sound escaped. Eleanor, her eyes burning with a controlled rage that belied the tremor in her hands, continued, her voice unwavering. "The adoption papers, I have them here, and DNA evidence. Everything." She produced a thick envelope, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. The room spun. For Isabel, the world fractured. The carefully constructed facade of her life, the identity she had built, shattered into a million pieces. Guilt, a heavy, suffocating weight, pressed down on her. She hadn't known. She couldn't have known. Could she? A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Her breath hitched. The ornate chandelier above seemed to blur. Julian, finally finding his voice, sputtered, "This is a lie, a malicious fabrication." His voice, usually commanding and confident, cracked, revealing the fear that gnawed at his composure. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a way to regain control of the situation that was spiraling violently out of his grasp. The carefully constructed image of the charming, successful billionaire was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a desperate, exposed man. The champagne glasses, forgotten, seemed to mock him with their silent, bubbly accusations. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, heavy as a tombstone. The ensuing chaos was a maelstrom of flashing cameras and whispered accusations. The scent of expensive perfume clashed with the metallic tang of fear in the air. Julian, his face a mask of furious denial, tried to wrestle back control, his voice a strained roar above the murmuring crowd. But Eleanor stood firm, her controlled fury radiating outwards like heat from a furnace. Her eyes, usually soft and kind, were now steely, reflecting the devastation that lay beneath her composure. Isabel, meanwhile, felt the floor tilt beneath her, the opulence of the ballroom dissolving into a dizzying blur. The weight of her actions, the realization of her unwitting betrayal, crushed her. "This is a lie!" Julian screamed again, his voice cracking. He lunged for Eleanor, desperation clawing at his carefully cultivated composure. But she didn't flinch. Security guards, alerted by the sudden eruption, intervened, their presence a stark contrast to the glittering surroundings. Later, huddled in the sterile confines of a private room, offered by a sympathetic hotel manager, the raw emotions exploded. Isabel sobbed, the sound ragged and broken, her body racked with guilt and confusion. Eleanor, though outwardly calm, held her daughter close, her touch both comforting and firm. The scent of lavender from Eleanor's perfume mingled with the sharp, metallic smell of Isabel's tears. "I didn't know," Isabel choked out, her voice thick with tears. "I truly didn't know he was my father." Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair, her silence a testament to the profound understanding that had passed between them. The years of distance, of a life lived with a different reality, suddenly felt insignificant in comparison to this overwhelming shared pain, this shared betrayal. The silence held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a shared history stretching back 15 years, to a decision born of desperation and love, a decision that had now shattered their lives in unimaginable ways. The events of that evening played out over and over in Isabel's mind. A loop of humiliation, betrayal, and the crushing weight of an unexpected truth. She saw herself as a pawn in Julian's callous game of ambition and deceit, a pawn she had played without knowing the rules. The next morning, the opulent hotel suite felt like a gilded cage. The scent of lilies, usually a symbol of purity, now hung heavy with the stench of betrayal. Isabel stared out the window, the city sprawling below a hazy, indifferent sky. The champagne wishes of the previous evening had curdled into a bitter taste of reality. Eleanor sat beside her, a quiet strength radiating from her. The controlled fury of the night before had given way to a weary sadness. "He'll try to control the narrative," Eleanor said softly, her voice a low murmur against the city's hum. "He always does." She reached out, her hand covering Isabel's. The warmth was a balm to Isabel's raw nerves. Isabel nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I feel like I've woken up in a nightmare." The weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating. The glittering world she'd inhabited for so long was now fractured, warped into a grotesque parody of what she'd believed. "It wasn't your fault, Isabel," Eleanor repeated, her voice firm but gentle. "None of this was your fault." A hesitant knock came at the door. A lawyer, crisp and efficient, entered, his briefcase a symbol of the legal battle about to commence. The sterile scent of his expensive cologne clashed with the lingering perfume of the previous night's chaos. He spoke in precise legal terms, outlining Julian's attempts to discredit Eleanor, to dismiss the adoption documents as fraudulent. Isabel felt a cold dread creep into her heart. This wasn't just about Julian's broken vows. It was about the demolition of everything she knew. The room, once a refuge, felt suddenly claustrophobic, the gilded cage bars tightening around them. Eleanor, however, listened with a newfound resolve hardening her eyes. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, steely determination. The fight had begun, and Eleanor, for the first time in years, was ready. The lawyer's words hung in the air, sharp and precise, like shards of glass. The opulent suite, once a symbol of Julian's wealth and power, now felt like a suffocating tomb. Isabel, her reflection a pale ghost in the polished marble surface of the vanity, felt a tremor of fear. The champagne flutes, still half-filled from the previous night's disastrous celebration, mocked her with their silent, bubbly judgment. Eleanor, however, remained remarkably composed. The controlled sadness in her eyes held a spark of something else. Steel, determination, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. "They'll claim it's a conspiracy," Eleanor said, her voice low, a counterpoint to the lawyer's crisp pronouncements. The scent of lilies, now a cruel reminder of the shattered vows, seemed to intensify, clinging to the heavy drapes. Isabel flinched. The weight of her secret, once a heavy burden she carried alone, now felt amplified, a shared sorrow binding her to her mother. "But the documents, they're irrefutable," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's low hum. Doubt gnawed at her, a relentless worm in her conscience. Had she acted impulsively? Was her revelation a desperate act of rebellion, or a necessary truth? Eleanor squeezed her hand, the gesture small but reassuring. "They'll try to discredit everything," she said, her gaze unwavering. "They'll use money, power, lies, but we have the truth." A faint smile played on her lips, a flicker of defiance against the looming darkness. The lawyer continued, outlining Julian's legal team, a formidable force of seasoned professionals, their reputation preceding them like a chilling wind. He spoke of smear campaigns, of potential lawsuits, of the media storm brewing outside, a ravenous beast hungry for scandal. The city lights, a sparkling tapestry from the window, seemed to reflect the chaotic turmoil within the room. Isabel's breath hitched. The thought of Julian's power, his relentless pursuit of control, sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't merely a battle over a marriage. It was a war for her identity, her past, her future. The taste of betrayal lingered, acrid and bitter, a stark contrast to the sweetness she'd once associated with Julian. Eleanor stood, her movements deliberate, confident. The weariness in her eyes hadn't vanished, but it was overshadowed by a newfound resolve. "We'll fight back," she declared, her voice gaining strength, a quiet roar against the impending storm. She looked at Isabel, her gaze unwavering. "We'll fight for our truth." The scent of lilies, the champagne, the lawyer's cologne, all faded into insignificance as a new scent emerged. The scent of resilience, of a mother's unwavering love, and a daughter's newfound strength. The battle had begun, and the first shot had been fired. The news exploded. Headlines screamed of billionaire's bigamy, shattered vows, and daughter's deception. Julian's meticulously crafted image, once a symbol of success and power, crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. His carefully cultivated persona, polished to a gleaming sheen, was now tarnished, revealing cracks of selfishness and deceit. The relentless glare of the media spotlight felt like a physical assault. Flashback. Eleanor, young and heartbroken, clutching a tiny Isabel, her tears a silent testament to a sacrifice born of love and desperation. The adoption agency's sterile environment, the stark contrast to the warmth she longed to offer her child, replayed in her memory, a haunting echo of her past. The decision, once a desperate act of survival, now felt like a poisoned chalice. Isabel, trapped in the maelstrom of public opinion, felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Guilt gnawed at her. She saw her face, pale, haunted, reflected in the numerous screens broadcasting the unfolding drama. Resentment towards Julian simmered, a bitter cocktail mixed with confusion and self-loathing. The luxurious apartment, once a haven, now felt like a gilded cage. The scent of expensive perfume couldn't mask the bitter taste of betrayal. "It's all a mess," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, to Eleanor, who sat beside her, a fortress of quiet strength against the storm raging outside. Eleanor's eyes, usually sparkling with wit and warmth, were shadowed with exhaustion, but her grip on Isabel's hand was firm. "We'll face it together," Eleanor murmured, her voice a low hum of reassurance. The gentle pressure of her mother's hand conveyed more than words could ever express. Unwavering support, a silent promise of enduring love. The fear that gripped Isabel began to ease, replaced by a nascent sense of hope, a fragile seedling pushing through the hardened soil of betrayal. The legal battle loomed, a monstrous wave threatening to engulf them. But in the face of the storm, a newfound strength, a shared resilience, began to bloom. The relentless barrage of news coverage continued, a relentless tide washing over them. The opulent penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt suffocating. Eleanor, her usual vibrant spirit dimmed, sipped lukewarm tea, the china cup trembling slightly in her hand. The faint scent of jasmine, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, a cruel reminder of a life irrevocably altered. Isabel, huddled on a plush velvet sofa, stared blankly at the flickering television screen, the incessant commentary a dull roar in her ears. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, squeezed her chest. She hadn't intended for this. She'd merely wanted answers, a sliver of understanding about the man who'd claimed to be her father. Now, the answers had unleashed a storm that threatened to consume them all. "It's not your fault, Izzy," Eleanor said softly, her voice a balm against the turmoil. She reached across the chasm of grief and confusion separating them, her hand finding Isabel's. The touch, surprisingly strong, was a lifeline. Isabel flinched. "But it is," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I knew nothing about this, about the marriage, about him." She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and self-reproach. "How could I have been so blind?" Eleanor squeezed her hand. "You were a child, Isabel. He manipulated you, just as he manipulated everyone." The words were a revelation, a shift in perspective. Isabel saw a flicker of steel in her mother's eyes, a resilience she hadn't fully grasped until now. It wasn't just quiet strength. It was furious resolve. A knock on the door interrupted the fragile moment. A sharp-suited lawyer entered, his face grim. He presented Eleanor with a stack of documents, the weight of legal battles already looming large. The scent of expensive cologne couldn't mask the chilling undercurrent of impending conflict. The luxurious setting offered no refuge from the impending storm. The fight for Julian's empire, and more importantly, their own emotional and psychological well-being, had begun. The quiet strength in Eleanor's gaze, however, offered a small beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. The news channels blared, a cacophony of flashing images and accusatory headlines. Julian's face, usually radiating self-assured charm, was now contorted in a mask of simmering rage. The penthouse, usually a haven of opulence, felt like a gilded cage. Eleanor, her composure a carefully constructed facade, watched Isabel, her adopted daughter, curled on the sofa, a small, fragile bird caught in a hurricane. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, now felt suffocating, a cruel irony. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the television's drone. Tears traced paths through the carefully applied makeup, smudging the already wavering lines of her composure. Guilt gnawed at her, a relentless beast. Eleanor crossed the room, the plush carpet yielding silently beneath her feet. She knelt beside Isabel, her touch hesitant. "I know, darling," she murmured, her voice a low hum against the storm raging outside. "But you were a child, manipulated by a man who thought he owned the world." The words were a lifeline, a bridge across the chasm of betrayal. Isabel flinched, recoiling from the touch, but Eleanor held firm. "He is not your father, Izzy. He never truly was." The statement, though intended to be comforting, felt like a fresh wound. Isabel's gaze shifted, settling on a framed photograph on the coffee table. A picture of a younger Eleanor, her face etched with a sadness that mirrored Isabel's own. A sudden wave of nausea washed over Isabel. The weight of her actions, the revelation, the ensuing chaos, crushed her. The image of Julian, his face twisted in fury during the wedding interruption, flashed through her mind. His desperate attempts to control the narrative, his lies, were now laid bare for the world to see. He used me," Isabel choked out, her voice breaking. The realization brought a strange sense of clarity. The fog of confusion began to lift, revealing a horrifying truth. She had been a pawn in his game, a tool to hurt Eleanor. The anger, sharp and sudden, was a powerful antidote to the crippling guilt. Eleanor held her close, the embrace a silent promise of support. The legal documents arrived then, a cold, stark reminder of the battles to come. But in that shared embrace, in the shared sorrow, a fragile seed of hope was sown. The fight would be long and arduous, but they wouldn't face it alone. Eleanor's resolve, once a quiet strength, now burned with a fierce, protective flame. The storm raged outside, but within the penthouse, a new kind of resilience was taking root. The penthouse suite, usually shimmering with polished surfaces and the soft glow of expensive lighting, felt cold and sterile. The scent of lilies, once a comforting presence, now hung heavy, cloying. Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, stared out at the city lights, a million pinpricks of indifference against the vast, indifferent night. Isabel, huddled on a plush chaise lounge, flinched at the sudden crackle of the television. A relentless barrage of headlines screaming betrayal and scandal. They're saying he's ruined," Isabel whispered, her voice barely a breath. The words hung in the air, thick with a mixture of fear and something else, a nascent anger. Eleanor turned, her gaze softening as she saw the trembling in Isabel's hands. She crossed the room, the luxurious carpet muffling her footsteps, and knelt beside her daughter. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if afraid to break something already fragile. "Ruined," Eleanor echoed softly. "Julian built his empire on lies, Isabel. This is just the beginning of the reckoning." She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the lines of Isabel's tear-streaked face. The touch, at first resisted, was eventually met with a shuddering sigh of acceptance. I didn't know," Isabel choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I really didn't." The guilt, raw and visceral, was evident in the tremor of her voice, the way her eyes darted nervously around the opulent room, as if expecting retribution to strike at any moment. Eleanor's expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of composure hiding the turmoil within. But the slight trembling of her hand betrayed her inner struggle. "I know, darling," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. "But you were a child, a victim just like me." The shared sorrow created an unexpected bond, a silent understanding bridging the chasm of their shared trauma. The weight of the situation pressed down on them both, the shattered trust, the public humiliation, the looming legal battles. Yet, in the shared grief, a flicker of defiance ignited. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within, but within the shared embrace, a fragile resilience began to take hold. They would face this together. The fight had just begun. The next morning, the relentless glare of the city sun felt like a personal affront. Eleanor awoke to the insistent chirping of a misplaced canary, a jarring contrast to the silent fury simmering within her. The penthouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. The scent of lilies, yesterday a suffocating reminder of the ruined wedding, was gone, replaced by the sterile tang of antiseptic from the cleaning crew. She could almost hear the whispers of the city, judging, analyzing, dissecting her life. Isabel, still asleep on the chaise lounge, looked younger, smaller, more vulnerable than Eleanor remembered. The opulent surroundings seemed to mock her fragility. Guilt etched itself deeply into Isabel's face, a stark contrast to the meticulously applied makeup from the previous day. Eleanor moved cautiously, as if navigating a minefield of unspoken emotions. She made coffee, the rhythmic hiss of the machine a small comfort in the echoing silence. The news channels blared in the background, a relentless chorus of Julian's downfall. Each report was a fresh stab to the heart, yet a part of Eleanor felt a chilling satisfaction. They're saying he's bankrupt," Isabel whispered, her voice thick with sleep and dread, eyes still closed. Eleanor approached her daughter slowly, the plush carpet cushioning her steps. She sat beside her, the cool silk of the chaise lounge a stark contrast to the warmth she tried to convey in her touch. "Bankruptcy is a small price to pay for the devastation he caused," Eleanor replied, her voice low and steady. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, yet they felt liberating. The controlled fury she had displayed yesterday was gone. A deeper, more profound exhaustion had taken its place. Isabel's eyes snapped open, wide and questioning. "But what about everything else? The other things he did?" Eleanor sighed, the sound a heavy weight escaping her lungs. "Those things, Isabel, those we'll uncover together. This isn't just about Julian's empire. It's about truth, justice, and our future." She paused, her gaze softening. "We start with the truth, and it begins with us." The shared weight of the situation hung between them, a thick, suffocating blanket. Yet, within the shared grief, a small spark of hope began to kindle, a mutual understanding, a fragile bond built on shared pain. The fight, Eleanor thought, had only just begun. The relentless hum of the city outside was a dull counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Eleanor's heart. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, sliced through the gap in the curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a microscopic ballet of chaos mirroring her inner turmoil. The penthouse, usually a symbol of her opulent life, felt suffocating, a gilded cage indeed. Isabel lay curled on the sofa, a crumpled heap of silk and exhaustion, her face pale and drawn. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma a fleeting comfort. The news, a constant, nagging presence, crackled from the television, reporting Julian's financial implosion with gleeful abandon. Each report felt like a hammer blow, yet a strange sense of quiet satisfaction, a cold, hard relief, settled over her. They're saying he's gone, Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes glued to the screen. The word gone hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Gone from their lives, gone from the public eye, gone from the power he craved. Eleanor sat beside her daughter, the plush cushions sinking under her weight. She reached out, her touch hesitant, placing a comforting hand on Isabel's arm. The silk of her robe felt oddly cold against Isabel's trembling skin. "It's not just the money, is it?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the storm raging outside. She saw the unshed tears welling in Isabel's eyes, the weight of guilt and betrayal crushing her. "It's everything else." Isabel nodded, a silent admission. The mask of composure she'd worn throughout the previous day had finally crumbled. The casual cruelty, the calculated manipulations, the years of deception, they were all starting to surface raw and painful. "We'll face it together," Eleanor said, her voice firm but laced with empathy. The words were a promise, a lifeline extended to her daughter, but also a declaration to herself. She wouldn't let Julian's actions define them. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to unearth the truth, and to finally find peace amidst the wreckage. The fight, she knew, was far from over. But now, for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile seed of strength taking root in the fertile ground of her sorrow. The future remained uncertain, a vast and unknown landscape. But together, mother and daughter, they would navigate it. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume Eleanor usually wore. The hospital room, bathed in the pale fluorescence of overhead lights, felt cold and impersonal, a world away from the warmth of her penthouse. Isabel sat beside her mother's bed, her hand clasped tightly in Eleanor's, the thinness of her mother's hand a stark reminder of the emotional toll the past days had taken. Eleanor's eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence, were dull with exhaustion, her face pale and drawn. "The lawyers, they say," Eleanor began, her voice a mere whisper, each word a painful effort. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Isabel squeezed her mother's hand, a silent reassurance. "They're doing everything they can, Mom. Don't worry." She knew the words were hollow, a feeble attempt to soothe the deep wounds Julian had inflicted. The news reports had painted a devastating picture. Julian's empire was crumbling, his reputation in tatters. The legal battles had barely begun, but the damage was already catastrophic. Eleanor closed her eyes, a shudder running through her frail body. "It's not just the money, Isabel. It's the betrayal, the lie that built our whole life." Her voice cracked, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. The quiet sobs that escaped were a stark testament to the depth of her pain. The weight of years of carefully constructed lies, of a life built on a foundation of deceit, was finally crushing her. Isabel leaned closer, her heart aching for her mother. The revelation of her adoption, the shattering of her carefully constructed identity, was a trauma that echoed Eleanor's own. The shared pain, however different in origin, created an unexpected bond. The two women, once separated by the chasm of Julian's deceit, were now bound by a shared experience of loss and betrayal. "I know, Mom," Isabel whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but we'll get through this. Together." She felt a surge of resolve, a newfound strength born from adversity. This wasn't just about uncovering Julian's lies. It was about rebuilding their lives, forging a new future, free from his manipulative grasp. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But for the first time, Isabel felt a sense of hope, a shared purpose that transcended the devastation of the past. The fight had just begun, but they would face it, together, as mother and daughter, finally united against a common enemy: the truth. The mahogany of Julian's study felt slick under Eleanor's trembling fingers. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the gloom, illuminating the opulent chaos. Scattered papers, half-empty champagne flutes, a discarded silk tie. The air hung heavy with the scent of old leather and expensive regret. She ran a hand through her disheveled hair, the strands catching on the sharp edges of a broken picture frame, a fractured reflection of her shattered life. "He's trying to use a prenup," she whispered, more to herself than to Isabel, who sat silently by the window, her face etched with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. The city sprawling below offered no solace. It was a canvas of indifference, oblivious to her heartbreak. Isabel finally spoke, her voice low. "He won't get away with this, Mom. Not this time." Her gaze, usually bright and full of life, was clouded with a weary sadness. The recent events had stolen her youthful exuberance, replacing it with a sobering maturity. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "It's more than the money, Isabel. It's everything. 20 years gone." The weight of that statement pressed down on them both, a palpable thing in the suffocating silence of the room. The elegant surroundings mocked their pain, a stark reminder of the gilded cage Julian had built around them, a cage now crumbling around their ears. The sound of a breaking glass jolted them. Eleanor spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Isabel rushed to her side, her hand instinctively going to Eleanor's arm. It wasn't a physical threat, but the sound symbolized the final shattering of their illusion, the disintegration of their carefully constructed world. In the shattered remnants of a crystal decanter lay a reflection of their own fractured reality, mirroring the devastation in their hearts. The fight for their future was just beginning, and it would be a long, arduous struggle. The legal battles were only the start. The real war was for their souls. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of expensive perfume and simmering resentment. Eleanor, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of controlled fury. The subtle tremor in her hand, however, betrayed the inner turmoil raging beneath. Opposite her, Julian, his usual arrogance replaced with a veneer of forced composure, fidgeted with a pen, his expensive suit failing to hide the pallor beneath his carefully tanned skin. Isabel sat between them, a silent observer in a simple, yet elegant dress, her youthful face burdened with a gravity far beyond her years. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing through the hushed silence. "Ms. Vance," he addressed Eleanor, his voice resonating with the weight of the legal proceedings. "You are aware of the implications of this suit?" Eleanor met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Perfectly aware, Your Honor. My husband is attempting to invalidate a marriage that was complicated, to say the least." Her words were precise, each syllable weighted with carefully controlled emotion. Julian scoffed, a low, guttural sound. "Complicated? Eleanor is attempting to manipulate the system. Our marriage was null and void." "Objection." Eleanor's lawyer, a formidable woman with steely eyes, rose swiftly. "Mr. Vance is attempting to deflect attention from the central issue." The judge banged his gavel again. "Order. Mr. Vance, I suggest you restrain yourself." "Ms. Vance, please continue." Eleanor paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, landing on Isabel, who offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The adoption records are clear. Isabel was given up for adoption before I married Julian. He knew this. He knew this when he married me." The words hung in the air, a stark accusation dripping with both pain and truth. The courtroom felt colder, the silence heavier now, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The scent of lilies from a nearby bouquet felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness in the tense atmosphere. Isabel's hand tightened in her lap, her knuckles white. The weight of her secret, the impact of her revelation, pressed down on her, a crushing burden. The battle was far from over. It had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The fight for justice, for healing, and for a future still lay ahead. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered anxieties. Eleanor felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, each gaze a tiny pinprick of judgment. The scent of lilies, previously cloying, now felt like a fragile shield against the onslaught of emotions. Julian, pale and sweating, shifted in his expensive chair, the polished mahogany reflecting his strained features. His lawyer, a sleek, predatory woman, hissed a comment in his ear, her words lost in the general hum. Isabel, caught between them, felt a profound sense of isolation. Her simple dress, chosen for its understated elegance, felt like a flimsy disguise against the storm raging within her. Guilt clawed at her, a persistent ache in her chest. She'd never intended for things to escalate this far. She'd hoped for a quiet resolution, a way to escape the suffocating weight of her secret. But Julian's desperate attempts to control the narrative, his ruthless pursuit of his own desires, had left her with no other option. "Your Honor," Eleanor's lawyer said, her voice cutting through the tension, "we have additional evidence to present." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the lawyer as she produced a small, worn box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a single, tarnished locket. Eleanor's breath hitched. She hadn't seen this locket in years, a relic of a past she'd tried to bury. It was a tangible link to a decision born of desperation, a choice that had haunted her for decades. The tiny, engraved initials IV were a painful reminder of her youthful naivety, her shattering loss. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Julian watched, his face a mask of dawning horror. The locket. He'd forgotten about the locket. He'd thought it buried, lost in the labyrinth of his meticulously crafted life. The fragile facade of composure crumbled, replaced by a rising tide of fear. His carefully constructed world was teetering on the brink of collapse. The pen he'd been fiddling with clattered to the floor, the sharp metallic sound echoing the shattering of his carefully crafted illusion. The weight of his lies, his betrayals, pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. The judge's gaze was unwavering, his expression impassive, yet his silence spoke volumes. The battle was far from over. It had just entered a new, terrifying phase. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, felt colder than the marble beneath Eleanor's feet. Julian's lawyer, a viper in silk, leaned in, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Julian, however, offered no such solace. His eyes, usually glittering with arrogance, were now dull, reflecting the stark reality of his impending downfall. The locket, a tiny, tarnished symbol of a life irrevocably altered, sat on the mahogany table, a damning testament to his deceit. Isabel watched, her own guilt a lead weight in her stomach. The initial shock of the revelation had given way to a chilling certainty. This wasn't just about Julian's shattered marriage. It was about a web of lies meticulously spun over decades. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes, a fear mirrored in the subtle trembling of her hands clutching a tissue, but also a strength, a quiet determination that surprised even Isabel. "This locket," Eleanor's lawyer began, her voice clear and strong, "proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mr. Vance was legally married to Mrs. Vance at the time of his purported marriage to Miss Vance, his adopted daughter." The words hung in the air, each syllable a hammer blow against Julian's carefully constructed facade. Julian's breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the sudden hush that descended upon the courtroom. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged, only a strangled gasp. His carefully cultivated composure crumbled, revealing the raw fear beneath. The meticulously constructed world he had built, brick by painstaking brick, was now collapsing around him, and he had no one but himself to blame. His desperate attempts at control, his lies and manipulations, now stood starkly exposed. His arrogance, his self-assuredness had been his undoing. The courtroom, once a stage for his performance, now felt like a cage. Eleanor, witnessing his silent agony, felt a flicker of something akin to pity. It was swiftly replaced by a wave of cold fury, a long-suppressed rage now finally unleashed. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about a shattered trust, a violation of the deepest bonds of family. The locket, a physical manifestation of her past pain, had become a weapon of devastating truth. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. A hope born not from the promise of revenge, but from the quiet strength she found within herself. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but she was ready. The judge's gavel slammed down, a sharp crack echoing the shattering of Julian's meticulously crafted life. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered conversations and rustling papers. Eleanor, her face pale but resolute, felt a tremor run through her. The victory felt hollow, the air thick with the unspoken weight of years of deceit. Isabel, beside her, looked ashen. Guilt warred with a dawning understanding. Her gaze, usually bright and mischievous, was clouded with a deep sorrow. She reached out, her hand brushing Eleanor's, a silent offering of comfort. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently, offering a small, tired smile. Outside, the flashbulbs exploded like tiny bombs, capturing the raw emotion etched on their faces. The air vibrated with the relentless hum of news helicopters. The press, a ravenous pack, swarmed, their questions sharp and invasive. Julian, his face a mask of controlled fury, was escorted away, a figure of fallen grandeur. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her sparsely furnished apartment, the silence punctuated only by the distant city hum. The expensive decor of her former life felt like a cruel mockery. She traced the lines of the locket in her palm, a tangible reminder of the painful choice she had made, a choice that had come back to haunt them all. Tears welled, but she refused to let them fall. She had survived, and now she would rebuild. The phone rang, startling her. It was Isabel. "Mom!" Isabel's voice trembled. I don't know what to do. I feel responsible." Eleanor's voice softened. "Isabel, you are not responsible for Julian's actions. You were a victim too." A long silence followed, broken only by the soft sniffles on the other end of the line. "It's okay to feel lost, confused, even angry," Eleanor continued, her voice firm yet gentle. "We'll face this together. We'll get through this." The weight of the legal battle eased, but a new, more profound struggle began. Isabel, grappling with her identity, sought professional help. Eleanor found solace in quiet moments of reflection, slowly peeling back the layers of her past trauma. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, their bond strengthened by the fires of betrayal and the ashes of a shattered world. The journey to healing had just begun. The mahogany desk in Julian's once imposing office felt cold and alien under Eleanor's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight slicing through the grimy windows, highlighting the emptiness. She traced the ornate carvings, the wood cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning rage that still simmered beneath her composure. The investigation into Julian's past business dealings was yielding disturbing results. A slow drip of revelations that painted a portrait of systematic deception. A file lay open, detailing shady offshore accounts and falsified invoices. Each document was a fresh wound, a testament to Julian's callous disregard for ethics and the law. The air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and regret. She closed her eyes, the echoes of the courtroom still ringing in her ears. The phone rang, a jarring intrusion. It was Isabel. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Mom!" Isabel's voice was strained, a whisper barely audible above the city's hum. I found something. In the attic. A box of old things." A chill snaked down Eleanor's spine. The attic, a repository of forgotten memories, a place where shadows lingered. "What kind of things, Isabel?" Eleanor's voice was tight with apprehension. "Photographs, letters, a diary. About my adoption. Details, things you never told me." Isabel's voice cracked, the words tumbling out in a rush. "About why you gave me up." Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the ghost of that agonizing decision rising to haunt her once more. The pain was raw, the memories still vivid. The desperation, the fear, the impossible choice she had made. "Isabel," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "We can talk about this when you're ready." Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the quiet sobs that escaped Isabel's control. Eleanor could almost feel her daughter's fear and confusion through the phone line. This wasn't just about Julian anymore. This was about the unraveling of Isabel's entire identity, her sense of self, her understanding of her own history. Eleanor knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her daughter, for the fragile bond they were painstakingly rebuilding amid the wreckage of Julian's lies. The fight was far from over. The true battle was only just beginning. The attic air hung thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Isabel, clutching a tarnished silver locket, traced the engraved initials her breath catching in her throat. The attic's gloom seemed to press in on her, mirroring the weight of the secrets she'd uncovered. Photographs, yellowed and brittle, depicted a younger Eleanor, her eyes holding a sadness that mirrored Isabel's own current turmoil. Letters, penned in a delicate script, revealed a love story complicated by hardship, a choice made out of desperate love, not callous disregard. A diary, bound in worn leather, lay open on a dusty trunk. Isabel's fingers trembled as she read Eleanor's anguished words, detailing the agonizing decision to give her up for adoption, the crushing weight of poverty, the unwavering hope for a better future for her child. Tears streamed down Isabel's face, blurring the ink. She felt a searing empathy for the woman she'd once seen as a cold, calculating adversary, a woman who'd been betrayed as profoundly as herself. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the suffocating silence. Isabel hesitated, wiping her tears before answering. "Mom," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I understand now. So much of it. It makes sense." Eleanor's voice, though strained, held a note of cautious hope. "Isabel, my darling girl, I am so sorry. For everything." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain, a shared history finally emerging from the shadows. Isabel's anger, once a blazing inferno, was now tempered with understanding, replaced by a fragile tenderness that surprised even her. The locket, still clutched in her hand, felt less like a weapon of accusation and more like a precious link to a woman she was only beginning to truly know. The attic, once a repository of secrets, now felt like a space of reconciliation, a silent witness to the healing that was finally beginning. The fight wasn't over, not entirely. But for the first time, Isabel felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of forgiveness taking root amidst the ruins of a shattered life. The sterile fluorescent lights of the law office hummed, a counterpoint to the low thrum of anxiety in Isabel's chest. She sat opposite Mr. Davies, her lawyer, the scent of expensive leather and old paper filling the air. He pushed a file across the polished mahogany desk, the weight of it mirroring the weight on her heart. "Julian's financial records," he said, his voice low. "It's extensive and damning." Isabel opened the file, her fingers tracing the crisp edges of the documents. Pages upon pages detailed a web of deceit, shell corporations, offshore accounts, a meticulously crafted facade concealing years of fraudulent activity. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just about her. It was about countless others who'd been victimized by Julian's greed. Guilt, a familiar companion, tightened its grip. "There's evidence suggesting he systematically defrauded investors," Davies continued, his gaze serious. "Enough to potentially bring down his entire empire." Isabel felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The implications were staggering. The revelation of her parentage had already shattered her life, but this threatened to decimate the lives of countless others. She thought of Eleanor, her strength a beacon in the storm. She thought of the long hours Eleanor had spent combing through old papers and photographs, piecing together the truth about her past. She had not wanted this. A sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. "What about Eleanor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Davies leaned forward, his expression softening. "She's aware of the scale of Julian's misdeeds," he said gently. "She's been preparing herself as best she can." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's focused on protecting her assets, ensuring the damage to others is minimized. She wants to use any recovered funds to help those Julian wronged." Isabel closed her eyes, the weight of the truth settling upon her. The path forward felt impossibly complex, a minefield of moral dilemmas and difficult choices. She understood the rage that still burned within Eleanor, but she saw the burgeoning strength, too. A flicker of hope ignited in the suffocating darkness. The fight wasn't over, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for something better to emerge from the wreckage. The chance to rebuild, not just her own life, but the lives irrevocably altered by Julian's actions. The scent of old paper, once suffocating, now carried a hint of hope, a new scent of justice. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Eleanor's fingertips as she reviewed the latest financial reports. The sterile scent of the lawyer's office clung to her, a stark contrast to the heady perfume she'd worn to Julian's ill-fated wedding. Tears welled, but she blinked them back, her gaze firm. This wasn't about sorrow anymore. It was about survival. Isabel's revelation had cracked the foundation of her life, but the ensuing investigation had unearthed a far deeper chasm of deceit. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Isabel entered, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her young shoulders. "Mr. Davies, he says it's worse than we thought," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. "I know. The extent of his manipulations. It's staggering." She gestured to the documents scattered across the desk, a mountain of evidence detailing Julian's years of financial crimes. "It's not just the money," Isabel said, her voice catching. "It's the people, the investors, the employees. Their lives are ruined." A wave of guilt washed over her face, mirroring the torrent of self-reproach Eleanor had battled for weeks. "We have to make sure they're not forgotten," Eleanor said, her voice low but resolute. She reached across the desk, her hand covering Isabel's. The warmth of her touch was a small comfort in the vast expanse of their shared sorrow. "We'll fight for them, and for ourselves. We will rebuild." Isabel squeezed Eleanor's hand, a small spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. The shared grief had forged a strange bond between them, a kinship born from betrayal and a shared desire for justice. They were survivors, women wounded but not broken. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to their silent vow, a promise to face the future together, armed with the truth and the unwavering strength of their newfound bond. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the shattering revelation at the wedding, a fragile sense of hope began to bloom in the cold, sterile room. The scent of old paper and expensive leather no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it carried the faint, hopeful fragrance of a future being painstakingly rebuilt, brick by painful brick. Julian paced his penthouse apartment, the city lights a blurry, indifferent backdrop to his turmoil. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now mocked him with its icy chill. He swirled the remaining liquid, the clinking glass a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of his thoughts. The scandal had escalated beyond his control. The initial wave of public outrage had morphed into something far more insidious, a relentless investigation that threatened to dismantle his carefully constructed empire. He'd underestimated Eleanor's resolve, Isabel's willingness to cooperate, and the depth of his own deception. The phone buzzed, a shrill interruption. He snatched it, his voice tight. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." A crisp, lawyerly voice responded. "The deposition. They've uncovered evidence linking you to offshore accounts, sir. Significant sums. Untraceable." Julian's breath hitched. Untraceable? He'd been so meticulous. The cold dread that coiled in his gut tightened its grip. He slammed the phone down, the sound echoing the collapse of his carefully crafted facade. The opulent apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. He sank onto a plush velvet sofa, the soft fabric offering no comfort. He hadn't anticipated Isabel's unwavering commitment to the truth. He'd assumed she'd crumble under the pressure, overwhelmed by guilt and the social repercussions. Instead, she'd become a force he hadn't accounted for, a relentless, quiet storm. He'd underestimated the power of a wounded conscience. A flicker of movement caught his eye. His reflection stared back, a stranger in a tailored suit, a man whose arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, desperate fear. He saw the cracks in his meticulously constructed persona, the haunted eyes, the trembling hands, the stark exhaustion etched into his features. The city lights, once a symbol of his success, now seemed to mock his downfall, a silent, unwavering testament to his failure. The weight of his lies, his manipulations, the devastation he'd caused, it pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. For the first time, Julian Thorne felt truly alone. The game was over and he was losing. The mahogany table in Eleanor's lawyer's office felt cold beneath her fingertips. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. Across from her, Mr. Davies, a man whose calm demeanor belied a shrewd legal mind, reviewed the latest documents. The scent of old leather and expensive coffee hung in the air, a strangely comforting aroma amidst the chaos of her life. "The offshore accounts," Davies said, his voice low. "They're significant, Eleanor. More than enough to severely impact Julian's defense." He pushed a file towards her, the crisp paper a stark white against the dark wood. Eleanor didn't touch it. The weight of the information of Julian's betrayal, of Isabel's courage, of her own long-buried pain, pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket. I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city outside. The strength she'd displayed in the initial stages of the scandal felt brittle, fragile. Davies leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You've already done so much, Eleanor. This isn't about vengeance. It's about justice, about accountability." His words, though firm, held a thread of compassion. He understood the toll this had taken. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. She swiped at it, embarrassed. "Isabel, she's been through so much," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "Giving her up, it was the hardest thing I ever did. And now," she trailed off, unable to articulate the complexity of her feelings. Guilt, regret, and a flicker of unexpected pride warred within her. Davies nodded, his understanding silent but profound. He knew the story of the adoption, of the choices made under duress, of the sacrifices borne. "She's a remarkable young woman, Eleanor. Strong, principled, and she's found her voice." The words resonated, a balm to her wounded spirit. Seeing Isabel stand tall amidst the storm, refusing to be silenced, had been a revelation. It had shown Eleanor the resilience she possessed, a strength she'd almost forgotten in the face of Julian's relentless manipulation. A new resolve hardened her gaze. She reached for the file, her fingers trembling slightly. The game wasn't over. The fight for justice, for healing, for a future free from Julian's shadow, was far from finished. The weight of the evidence was heavy, but so was the weight of her newfound purpose. The scent of old leather and coffee faded as the scent of justice and new beginnings filled the space. Julian paced his penthouse apartment, the city lights a blurry, indifferent backdrop to his turmoil. The champagne he'd poured hours ago sat untouched, a testament to his inability to celebrate his supposed victory. The narrative he'd carefully crafted, a wronged husband, a scheming ex-wife, was cracking at the seams. Isabel's quiet strength, her unwavering resolve, was eroding his carefully constructed facade. The expensive Persian rug beneath his feet felt strangely coarse, mirroring the roughness of his own increasingly frayed nerves. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning anger simmering within him. He needed to regain control, to silence the whispers that threatened to consume him. He dialed his lawyer, the sharp ring cutting through the opulent silence. "Davies," he barked into the receiver, his voice strained. "We need to adjust our strategy, Isabel. She's proving more difficult than anticipated." The silence on the other end was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city. Julian could almost hear Davies' calculating mind at work. Meanwhile, Isabel sat in a small, sun-drenched cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee a welcome contrast to the heaviness in her heart. She'd met with a journalist, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp intellect, who had listened intently to her story. The weight of her secret, of her complicity in Julian's deception, pressed down on her, but the act of telling her story, of finally sharing her truth, was strangely liberating. A nervous tremor ran through her as she reread the journalist's email, confirming the interview's publication. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The consequences could be devastating, but a quiet sense of purpose, of finally taking control of her own narrative, began to bloom. The clinking of coffee cups, the murmur of conversation, the gentle warmth of the sun, these small comforts anchored her in the present, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Eleanor, on the other hand, found solace in the quiet rhythm of her days. She'd started volunteering at a local women's shelter, the simple act of helping others a balm to her wounded soul. The faces of the women she met, their stories of resilience and strength, mirrored her own journey. The work was physically and emotionally demanding, but she found a strange peace in the shared experiences, in the understanding looks exchanged across the room. One evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of activity and the gentle murmur of conversations, she allowed herself to cry, for the first time truly allowing herself to grieve the loss of the life she once knew and embrace the possibility of a new one. The weight of the past, while still present, no longer felt crushing, but rather as a reminder of her own profound strength. The future, once an uncertain, daunting prospect, was now an open path, waiting to be walked. Julian slammed his fist on the mahogany desk, the expensive pen skittering across the polished surface. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars did little to soothe his frayed nerves. His reflection in the glass-fronted bookcase showed a man ravaged, the carefully cultivated image of a powerful billionaire crumbling like dry leaves. "Damn her," he hissed, his voice thick with barely controlled rage. "She's playing a dangerous game." His lawyer, Davies, a man whose face held the permanent imprint of calculated indifference, merely raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Mr. Thorne, your emotional outbursts are unproductive. We need a strategic response, not a temper tantrum." Julian inhaled deeply, the sharp sting of unshed tears burning his eyes. He forced himself to calm down, the years of honing his image kicking in. "Fine. Davies, I want Isabel discredited. Find dirt. Anything. Her past. Her associations. I need something, anything, to counter her narrative." Meanwhile, Isabel sat across from the journalist, Sarah, in a small, book-lined office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the wall as Sarah listened intently. Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she confessed the details of her adoption, the years of manipulation, the suffocating reality of her complicity. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, tangible as the quiet tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. A nervous giggle escaped Isabel's lips. "It feels strange to finally say it out loud." She wrung her hands, the movement mirroring the turmoil inside her. Sarah's kind eyes held hers, full of understanding. "It's brave, Isabel, and it's important." Later, Eleanor found herself staring out at the ocean, the waves mirroring the turbulent emotions churning inside her. The salt spray on her face stung, a physical manifestation of the pain that still lingered. She thought of Isabel, her daughter, the child she'd given up, the child who now held the power to tear apart Julian's empire. And strangely, a small spark of sympathy flickered within her. A feeling of understanding, perhaps, for the complex and difficult path Isabel had walked. She had made sacrifices too. The night was quiet except for the pounding rhythm of the waves, each crest a small echo of the turmoil in Eleanor's heart. The salty wind carried away the bitterness and left only the hope for what might be built from the ashes. The antique clock in Eleanor's study chimed, each note a tiny hammer blow against the fragile piece she'd painstakingly constructed. The scent of lavender from the potpourri bowl did little to mask the lingering scent of betrayal. She traced the delicate veins in a worn photograph of Isabel as a child, a tiny, smiling girl with eyes that held a shadow of the turmoil to come. A soft knock echoed through the room. It was her lawyer, a kind woman named Meredith, whose presence always brought a sense of calm. "Eleanor, Meredith began, her voice low and measured. "We have new information regarding Julian's offshore accounts." Eleanor's breath hitched. "What is it?" The question was a whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic tick of the clock. Meredith handed her a file, the crisp paper cool against her fingertips. "Evidence of substantial fraud, far more extensive than we initially anticipated. It implicates several long-term employees, people Julian considered loyal friends." Eleanor stared at the documents, the weight of the revelations settling heavily on her chest. The intricate web of lies Julian had spun was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing the rotten core beneath. A cold dread seeped into her, replacing the simmering anger. This wasn't just about her marriage. It was about the systematic destruction of lives, a legacy of deceit extending far beyond her personal pain. Later that evening, a phone call came from Isabel. Her voice, usually bright and confident, trembled. "Mom," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "There's something else. Something I need to tell you. It's about my father." The unspoken words hung between them, heavy and loaded with implications. Eleanor felt a familiar pang of guilt, a wave of protective instinct washing over her. Isabel needed her, not just as her mother, but as a shield against the storm she'd unwittingly unleashed. The comforting scent of lavender now felt inadequate against the rising tide of fear and uncertainty. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders, heavy as the antique clock on her desk. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The opulent penthouse suite felt colder than usual, the city lights a stark contrast to the chill in Eleanor's heart. The scent of expensive champagne clung to the air, a bitter reminder of the lavish wedding she'd so dramatically disrupted. She stared out at the glittering cityscape, the vast expanse mirroring the emptiness she felt inside. Meredith's words echoed fraud, deceit, a legacy of destruction. Isabel's call hung heavy, the unspoken something else, a terrifying unknown. The rhythmic tick-tock of the antique clock in her study seemed to mock her fragile calm. She picked up a framed photo of Isabel, a child's laughter frozen in time, the image a painful counterpoint to the fear gripping her now. Later, a quiet knock. It was Michael, her longtime friend and confidant, his usually jovial face etched with concern. He held a steaming mug. "Hot chocolate," he offered softly, his voice a soothing balm. "You haven't touched anything all day." Eleanor accepted the mug, the warmth seeping into her hands, a small comfort in the storm raging within. "Michael," she began, her voice cracking, "I feel like I'm drowning. The things I've learned, the lies, it's more than I can comprehend." He sat beside her, his hand gently covering hers. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, Eleanor, but you're not alone. We'll face this together." His words were simple, but their strength resonated deep within her. The following days were a blur of legal paperwork, hushed phone calls, and the unsettling weight of impending revelations. Isabel's phone call had been a prelude to a torrent of information. A hidden trust fund, secret accounts, and a trail of broken promises stretching back decades. Each new piece of information chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of Julian's success, revealing the ruthless ambition beneath. One evening, sifting through old boxes in the attic, Eleanor stumbled upon a faded letter. It was from the adoption agency, detailing Isabel's adoption. A single, underlined sentence pierced her. "The biological father has requested no contact." A fresh wave of guilt washed over her, a sharp pain echoing the regret she'd carried for years. She had shielded Isabel from the truth about her father, but now, the truth threatened to engulf them both. The weight of her choices pressed down, suffocating her. The city lights, once a symbol of Julian's wealth, now felt like a cold, uncaring judgment. The unraveling of Julian's life, it seemed, was only the beginning of her own long and arduous journey toward healing and understanding. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Eleanor's trembling hands. The scent of old paper and dust filled the attic, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume that usually clung to Julian's possessions. The faded letter, brittle with age, felt like a physical manifestation of her past regrets. "The biological father has requested no contact," she whispered, the words a painful echo in the silent space. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, constricted her chest. She'd protected Isabel, yes, but at what cost? A low sob escaped her lips, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the attic. The weight of her decision, made years ago in a desperate attempt to secure Isabel's future, now felt like a crushing burden. Had she truly done what was best? Doubt, a venomous serpent, coiled in her heart. Days bled into weeks. The legal battles raged, each new revelation a hammer blow against Julian's carefully constructed empire. Isabel, initially defiant, now wrestled with a burgeoning sense of responsibility, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. One evening, Eleanor found Isabel in the garden, the city lights painting the night in shades of gold and gray. Isabel looked up, her eyes mirroring the city's somber glow. "Mom," Isabel began, her voice barely a whisper. I need to tell you something." Eleanor sat beside her, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the fire in her heart. "Tell me, darling," she said softly, her hand resting gently on Isabel's. Isabel hesitated, then blurted out, "There's more. About my father. About everything." Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the evening dew. The revelation hung heavy between them, unspoken words pregnant with the weight of decades of deception. The garden, once a sanctuary, now felt like the epicenter of a storm brewing. The future remained uncertain, a terrifying, yet strangely liberating unknown. But in the shared silence, a fragile understanding began to bloom, a glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage of the past. The journey ahead would be arduous, but they would face it together. The opulent boardroom, usually buzzing with the confident hum of Julian's empire, felt eerily silent. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the high windows, illuminating the grim faces gathered around the mahogany table. Long-time employees, their faces etched with a mixture of betrayal and fear, exchanged hushed whispers. Mr. Henderson, Julian's right-hand man for 30 years, cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the stillness. "The audits are in, sir," he said, his voice strained. "And, well, the discrepancies are significant." Julian, his usually impeccable composure shattered, stared at the documents spread before him, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water, the ice clinking a jarring counterpoint to the silence. The meticulously crafted facade, built on years of deception, was crumbling. He felt the cold sweat prickling his skin, the weight of his actions pressing down with crushing force. His carefully constructed world was collapsing. Isabel, observing from a shadowed corner of the room, felt a strange mix of fear and morbid fascination. The man she once saw as a powerful, invincible figure now looked defeated, reduced to a shell of his former self. The weight of her own involvement pressed upon her, a heavy cloak of guilt. She'd revealed the truth about her adoption, but the cascading consequences extended far beyond her own family. This was about the lives of dozens of people who believed in Julian, who relied on him. That evening, Eleanor received a call from her lawyer. The news was devastating. Julian's legal team was attempting to use a loophole, placing the responsibility of the financial irregularities on Eleanor, claiming she was aware of the illegal activities. Eleanor felt a surge of anger, a fire igniting in her chest. But beneath the anger, a deeper sorrow took hold. The woman she once was, the woman who sacrificed everything, was being dragged through the mud again, a pawn in Julian's desperate game of self-preservation. The fight was far from over, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the full extent of Julian's deceit was yet to be uncovered. She felt a tremor of fear run through her, a fear not for herself, but for Isabel, trapped between the warring factions of her past. The future was a murky, uncertain sea, but Eleanor resolved to navigate it, to find solid ground, not only for herself, but for her daughter. The fight for Isabel's future and her own peace had just begun. The mahogany desk in Eleanor's lawyer's office felt cold beneath her fingertips. The scent of expensive leather and old paper did little to soothe the tremor in her hands. Outside, the city hummed with a life she felt increasingly detached from. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man whose face usually held an unflappable calm, looked grim. "They're trying to pin everything on you, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "Using obscure clauses in prenuptial agreements, things you signed years ago, before you even knew the extent of his dealings." Eleanor felt a cold dread spread through her. It wasn't the financial implications that chilled her. She had enough to live comfortably, even lavishly. It was the sheer audacity of it, the cynical manipulation, the ruthless disregard for her well-being. "He'll stop at nothing, will he?" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Davies nodded, his gaze heavy with concern. "He's cornered, desperate, and he's dragging everyone down with him." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Isabel, she's caught in the crossfire. He's trying to use her as leverage." The news hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Isabel, already grappling with the revelation of her adoption and its devastating consequences, now faced being used as a pawn in Julian's desperate game. The image of her daughter, vulnerable and confused, filled Eleanor's mind. A fierce protectiveness, a primal rage, ignited within her. "I won't let him," Eleanor vowed, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "I won't let him hurt her." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor. "We need to fight back. We need to expose him completely. Everything." That evening, Eleanor found Isabel sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, the city lights painting streaks of gold and orange across the floor. Isabel looked up, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and worry. The usual vibrant sparkle had dimmed, replaced by a haunting weariness. "Mama," Isabel began, her voice strained, I think I understand now why you gave me up. It wasn't about not loving me." Eleanor knelt, pulling her daughter into a hug, the scent of her daughter's hair a familiar comfort in the face of overwhelming chaos. "My darling girl," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was done out of love, out of a desperate need to protect you." Isabel nodded, her tears mingling with Eleanor's. "I know," she whispered, "and I forgive you." The unspoken weight between them, the shared betrayal, the looming threat of Julian's machinations, hung heavy in the air. But in that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the city lights, a new bond was forming, a strength forged in the crucible of shared pain and resilience. The fight was far from over, but mother and daughter faced it together, their love a shield against the storm. The city sprawled beneath them, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow from the panoramic window of Eleanor's penthouse. Champagne flutes, untouched, sat on a table beside a half-eaten plate of caviar, ironic symbols of a life that felt both distant and suffocating. Isabel, her face pale but resolute, sipped lukewarm tea. The warmth of the liquid seemed to do little to thaw the chill that had settled in her bones. "He's relentless," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in her throat. She'd spent the last few days poring over old financial statements, documents Julian had meticulously tried to hide, uncovering a web of deceit that stretched back decades. Each revelation felt like another blow. Eleanor nodded, her own eyes reflecting the city's shimmering lights, but mirroring none of their brilliance. The weight of the legal battles, the relentless pressure from Julian's lawyers, the fear for Isabel, it all pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of anxiety. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting fragrance, now seemed heavy and cloying, mirroring the heaviness in her heart. "They're trying to bankrupt me, Isabel, to discredit me, to erase everything I've built." Eleanor's voice cracked, the controlled composure she'd maintained for so long finally fracturing. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let Julian see her weakness, even from afar. Isabel reached across the table, her hand covering Eleanor's. The contact was a silent reassurance, a shared understanding of the storm they were weathering. "We won't let him," Isabel vowed, her voice stronger now, infused with a newfound resolve. "We'll expose him. Everything." The chill wind howled outside, rattling the windows, a stark counterpoint to the quiet determination that had settled between mother and daughter. The city lights, once symbols of Julian's power and wealth, now felt like distant stars, guiding them towards a future they were creating themselves. A future built not on riches and deceit, but on truth, resilience, and the unwavering strength of a bond forged in fire. The fight was far from over, but in this shared moment of quiet defiance, a powerful alliance was formed, promising a future where love, not power, would prevail. The caviar remained uneaten, a testament to the bitter taste of betrayal. Yet the unspoken promise in their clasped hands hinted at a sweeter future, slowly, painstakingly, being rebuilt. The mahogany of Julian's once pristine desk was now scarred with the frantic scratches of his pen, a frantic dance mirroring the chaos in his mind. He reread the latest damning article, the headline screaming betrayal in bold, stark letters. The scent of stale coffee and fear hung heavy in the air, a grim counterpoint to the expensive artwork adorning the walls, art that now seemed mocking in its opulent silence. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling. A sharp knock echoed through the opulent office, followed by the entrance of his longtime lawyer, Mr. Finch, his face etched with worry lines. "Julian," Finch began, his voice hushed. "The banks are pulling their support. The shareholders are panicking." Julian slammed his fist on the desk, the sound jarring in the tense silence. "They'll come around," he growled, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This is temporary, a smear campaign." His eyes, usually glittering with ambition, were now shadowed with desperation. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of dread. Finch sighed, his gaze softening with a weary pity. "Julian, the evidence is overwhelming. Isabel's testimony, it's devastating." He paused, watching Julian's face, the mask of control starting to crack. The man before him was not the ruthless billionaire he'd known for decades, but a wounded animal, cornered and desperate. The opulent office, once a symbol of power, now felt like a gilded cage. Julian's shoulders slumped, the fight seemingly draining out of him. He looked out the window, the city lights blurring into a meaningless spectacle. For the first time, the enormity of his actions hit him with full force. He had built his life on a foundation of lies, betrayal, and manipulation, and now the foundation was cracking, threatening to swallow him whole. The weight of his deceit was crushing, leaving him hollow and exposed. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken regrets. His empire, his wealth, his reputation, all were falling apart, leaving only the bitter taste of his own destruction. The game was over. He had lost. The biting November wind whipped through Eleanor's hair as she stood on the balcony of her newly rented apartment, a stark contrast to Julian's opulent penthouse. The city lights, once symbols of his power, now felt distant and insignificant. Below, the sounds of the city were a muffled roar, a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within her. She clutched a steaming mug of chamomile tea, the warmth a fragile shield against the lingering chill of betrayal. A soft knock came at the door. It was Isabel. She looked pale, thinner, her usual vibrant spirit dimmed. The weight of her actions, the consequences of her choices, were etched on her face. "Mom," Isabel began, her voice trembling slightly. I need to talk to you." Eleanor gestured for her to sit. The apartment, though small, felt safe, a haven from the storm raging outside, and the one brewing inside Isabel. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell me everything." Isabel hesitated, wringing her hands. "It's about Julian's, his offshore accounts. There's more, much more than we thought. Money laundering, tax evasion. I found documents hidden in a safe deposit box." Her voice cracked, betraying a mix of fear and guilt. The scent of fear clung to her like a second skin. Eleanor listened, her heart aching for her daughter. This wasn't just about Julian's downfall anymore. It was about the potential destruction of countless lives, the ripples of his deceit spreading far beyond their immediate circle. The weight of the revelations pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, yet a quiet strength began to bloom in the face of it. The years of pain, the betrayal had forged something resilient within her. "And what are you planning to do, Isabel?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady, calm despite the turmoil within. The silence that followed was filled only with the distant city sounds. The flickering gaslight cast dancing shadows across Isabel's face, highlighting the conflict within her. I don't know," she whispered, her eyes welling up. "Part of me wants to expose everything to make him pay, but the other part, it's terrified of the consequences. Innocent people will be hurt." Eleanor reached across and took Isabel's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "We'll face it together, sweetheart. We'll find a way, but we'll do it thoughtfully, carefully, weighing the consequences of each decision." The warmth of her hand, the quiet strength in her eyes, offered Isabel a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her guilt. The city lights, previously a symbol of Julian's power, now seemed to recede, replaced by a nascent hope, a shared strength arising from the ashes of betrayal. The mahogany door to Julian's opulent study felt heavy in Eleanor's hand, the polished surface cool against her trembling fingers. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars, a stark contrast to the crisp November air outside. Julian sat at his massive desk, his back to her, the silhouette of his shoulders slumped, a stark departure from his usual imperious posture. He hadn't looked at her directly since the wedding debacle. "Julian," Eleanor began, her voice barely a whisper, the sound swallowed by the cavernous room. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a hammer blow against her already fragile composure. He swiveled slowly, his face etched with lines of weariness, his eyes shadowed and dark. The arrogance, the carefully cultivated facade of invincibility, had crumbled, leaving behind a man ravaged by his own actions. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, devoid of its usual condescending charm. I didn't know." The words hung in the air, thin and unconvincing. "Didn't know?" Eleanor's voice rose, sharp with suppressed fury. The carefully constructed dam of her composure began to crack. "Didn't know Isabel was your daughter? Didn't know you were still legally married to me? Don't insult me with your pathetic denials." Tears welled, blurring her vision, but she refused to let them fall. He rose, his chair scraping against the polished floor, a harsh sound that cut through the tension. He paced the length of the room, his movements restless, agitated. "It was a mistake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But I loved you, Eleanor. I still do." "Loved me?" Eleanor laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You loved the power I gave you, the legitimacy my name brought you. You used me, Julian. You used Isabel." The weight of years of betrayal, of subtle manipulations and deliberate omissions, crashed down on her. She felt a burning anger rising, a fierce protectiveness towards Isabel. Julian stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping again. The bravado drained from him, leaving a hollow shell. He looked defeated, a stark contrast to the powerful man she'd once known. The realization of his loss hung heavy in the air, his fortune, his reputation, and now, irrevocably, Eleanor. The silence settled again, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions, a chilling prelude to the coming storm. The weight of their shared past hung between them, palpable and suffocating. The confrontation had begun, its full impact yet to be felt. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, clashed jarringly with the metallic tang of blood in the air. It clung to the plush carpet of the penthouse suite, a grim reminder of the shattered glass and the frantic struggle that had taken place just hours ago. Isabel, pale and trembling, sat curled on a velvet chaise lounge, her breath hitching in ragged gasps. Eleanor, her composure a fragile mask, knelt beside her. He tried to stop me," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's muted roar. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the dried blood on her cheek. She clutched a small, antique silver locket, a gift from Eleanor, a tangible link to a past she was only beginning to understand. Eleanor gently touched Isabel's arm, her touch conveying more than words could express. "I know, sweetheart, I know." The weight of the situation pressed down on Eleanor, a crushing burden of betrayal and the agonizing complexity of a mother's love. She'd given Isabel away, believing she was doing what was best. Now, that decision had come back to haunt them both. Isabel looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I didn't mean. I never wanted to hurt you, Mom. But he..." She choked back a sob. "He's never going to let this go. He'll fight it. He'll use everything he has." Eleanor nodded, her gaze hardening. The fear in Isabel's eyes fueled a new resolve within her. Julian's attempts to control the narrative, to manipulate the situation, were over. "He won't win this time, Isabel," Eleanor said, her voice firm but laced with a weariness that spoke volumes of the emotional toll. "We have the truth on our side, and we have each other." She stood, her eyes reflecting a steeliness that belied the storm raging within. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the wedding's disastrous interruption, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a tenacious spark igniting in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle for truth, for justice, and for their fractured family had just begun in earnest. The penthouse, once a symbol of Julian's opulent power, now felt like a battlefield, its luxury a cruel mockery of the raw emotions that filled the air. The coming confrontation would be brutal, but Eleanor and Isabel were ready to face it together. The penthouse, usually a glittering beacon of Julian's wealth, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, so aggressively sweet, now felt cloying, a macabre perfume clinging to the aftermath of their struggle. Eleanor, her tailored suit rumpled, ran a hand through her hair, the gesture betraying the exhaustion etched onto her face. The bloodstains, thankfully small, were a stark contrast to the opulent furnishings. Isabel, still trembling, clutched the silver locket, its cool metal a small comfort against the overwhelming fear. "He'll use his lawyers," Isabel whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The fear wasn't just for herself. It was for Eleanor, for the precarious stability they'd so recently found. Eleanor knelt, her touch gentle on Isabel's arm. "He will," she acknowledged, her voice calm but resolute. The calm was a carefully constructed facade, masking the icy dread that coiled in her gut. Julian's ruthlessness was legendary. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a war for her life, for Isabel's future, for the very truth itself. "But he won't win," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "We have the truth, we have each other, and we have something else, something he can't buy." Isabel looked up, confusion warring with the lingering terror in her eyes. "What?" Eleanor smiled, a tired but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We have each other's backs. We're family, and that's more powerful than all his money." She stood, her gaze firm, focused. The quiet strength in her eyes was a powerful counterpoint to the devastation around them. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a reclamation of their lives, a defiant stand against the crushing weight of Julian's power. The battle lines were drawn. The fight had begun. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of Julian's empire, was now their battlefield, and they were ready. The confrontation took place in Julian's study, a room usually reserved for meticulously orchestrated business deals, now a battlefield of shattered illusions. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars, hung heavy with unspoken accusations. Eleanor, her composure a fragile shield against the raw pain, stood facing Julian. He sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his usual arrogance replaced by a simmering fury that threatened to boil over. "This isn't just about money, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice low but unwavering. The words hung in the air, each syllable a carefully placed stone in a wall of defiance. She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, a brief crack in his carefully constructed facade. Julian leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Don't play games, Eleanor. You know what this is about." He gestured around the opulent room, the symbol of his power and wealth. "This is about everything I've built." "It's about Isabel," Eleanor countered, her voice rising slightly. "It's about the daughter you abandoned, the daughter you tried to marry. It's about the lies you've built your empire on." The words were sharp, like shards of glass. She saw Isabel watching them from the doorway, her face a mask of apprehension, her hands clenching and unclenching. A tremor ran through Julian's carefully controlled demeanor. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor cut him off. "You think you can buy your way out of this, Julian? You think money can erase the pain, the betrayal, the sheer cruelty of your actions?" A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the years of hurt and suppressed emotions finally unleashed. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the silent room. "You're tearing my life apart," he roared, his voice cracking with barely contained rage. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Eleanor met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with righteous anger. "It was supposed to happen, Julian. It had to happen. You reap what you sow, and your harvest is bitter indeed." She turned, walking towards Isabel, who now stood hesitantly in the doorway. "Come, Isabel. Let's leave this mausoleum of deceit behind." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Isabel's arm, a silent promise of unwavering support. The two women moved towards the door, leaving Julian alone in his opulent prison, the crumbling edifice of his meticulously crafted world collapsing around him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint chime of a grandfather clock marking the irreversible passage of time, and the slow, deliberate closing of the study door. The weight of Julian's actions, and the consequences to come, hung heavy in the air. Isabel stood in the hallway, the scent of lilies from Eleanor's bouquet lingering in the air, a stark contrast to the stale, masculine scent of Julian's study. She replayed her mother's words, the steely resolve in her voice echoing in her ears. Leaving had been easier than she anticipated. The weight of the secret, the crushing guilt, felt momentarily lighter. Yet, a profound unease settled in her stomach, revealing more secrets, potentially ruining more lives. The thought gnawed at her. The opulent hotel suite felt alien, the hushed luxury a mockery of the turmoil in her soul. Eleanor, surprisingly calm, was unpacking a small bag, the soft rustle of fabric a counterpoint to Isabel's inner storm. Eleanor looked up, catching Isabel's conflicted gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, held a depth of understanding that surprised Isabel. "It's all right to hesitate, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice gentle yet firm. "There's no easy answer here, but you deserve to live your life without this burden." She paused, her hand resting on Isabel's arm, a silent gesture of support. "And if revealing more hurts others, we'll face it together." Isabel swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. "But what if I'm wrong? What if it destroys everything else?" Eleanor smiled, a small, sad smile. "Sometimes, destroying the old makes way for something new, something better. We can't control the outcome, Isabel, only our choices. And right now, your choice is about living truthfully." The quiet strength in her mother's words, a stark contrast to Julian's blustering rage, filled Isabel with a quiet sense of peace, a fragile hope blossoming amidst the wreckage. The weight of her decision remained, but she felt a shift, a strengthening resolve. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with potential consequences. But for the first time since the wedding's shattering interruption, Isabel felt a flicker of something resembling freedom. The morning light, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains of the hotel suite, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Isabel sat on the edge of the plush bed, the luxurious fabric a stark contrast to the roughness of her inner turmoil. Eleanor, already dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, sipped tea, the delicate clinking of fragile sound in the otherwise silent room. The weight of the previous night's revelations hung heavy, a tangible presence in the air. "I can't sleep," Isabel confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The confession hung between them, unspoken anxieties swirling like the dust motes. Eleanor set down her cup, the soft click a quiet punctuation mark. She crossed the room, her movements graceful despite the tremor in her hand as she reached out and gently touched Isabel's arm. "It's all right, darling. You've carried this burden for far too long." Isabel flinched at the word burden, a familiar sting accompanying its weight. "But what if revealing more secrets hurts innocent people? What if I destroy lives in the process of saving my own?" Eleanor's gaze softened. "There are no easy answers, Isabel, but you can't live your life shrouded in secrecy, consumed by guilt. It's not your burden alone to carry. You're not responsible for Julian's actions." A single tear traced a path down Isabel's cheek, mirroring the subtle crack in the facade of her composure. "But he was my father figure. And what about everything else? The other secrets?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The unspoken words hung heavy between them. The secrets about Julian's business dealings, the potential collateral damage of her confession. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "We'll face whatever comes next together, Isabel. We always have." Her eyes held a strength that belied her own vulnerability. The unspoken promise hung in the air, a promise of shared pain, of mutual support. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm ray of light into the room, a silent promise of hope amidst the looming shadows of their uncertain future. Isabel took a deep breath, the weight of her decision still immense, but now shared, lessening the unbearable pressure. The path ahead remained uncertain, yet somehow, for the first time, it felt less lonely. The fragile hope, nurtured in the quiet strength of her mother's love, started to grow. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within Isabel. Across from her, Eleanor's face was etched with a weariness that belied her composed exterior. The scent of expensive coffee hung heavy in the air, a bitter aroma mirroring the situation. Isabel nervously twisted a silver ring, the cool metal a small comfort against the rising tide of anxiety. "It's not just about Julian," Isabel finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the tense silence. The words hung suspended, heavy with unspoken implications. Eleanor's eyes, usually so warm and inviting, were now guarded, watchful. "What is it, darling?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but firm, a subtle command for Isabel to proceed. Isabel took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. "There are other things, other secrets he kept hidden, things that could hurt other people, innocent people." The confession spilled out, a torrent of guilt and fear. The ring twisted faster, a frantic gesture betraying her inner turmoil. Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You need to tell me, Isabel. All of it. We face this together." The unwavering support in her voice was a lifeline in Isabel's sea of doubt. But the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. Isabel recounted the fragments of conversations overheard, the hushed whispers in dimly lit offices, the glimpses of coded emails, evidence of Julian's systematic financial manipulation, his betrayal extending far beyond their family. Her voice trembled as she described the potential fallout, the shattered lives, the financial ruin that could follow her confession. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against Isabel's fragile resolve. Eleanor remained still, absorbing the weight of the revelations, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "So, it's not just a personal betrayal, but a betrayal of trust on a far larger scale," Eleanor stated, her gaze unwavering. A subtle shift in her demeanor signaled a hardening of resolve. The initial shock had given way to a steely determination. "We'll need to act carefully. This needs a strategic approach. We'll need legal counsel, and we'll need to protect the innocent." She reached across the table, her hand covering Isabel's. "But we'll do it together, and we won't back down." The touch, firm and reassuring, conveyed a silent promise of unwavering support. The weight on Isabel's shoulders didn't disappear, but it felt slightly lighter, shared now, between mother and daughter. The future remained uncertain, terrifying even, but for the first time, it felt less lonely. The decision hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity clinging to the New York afternoon. Isabel sat on the edge of Eleanor's sprawling terrace, the city a shimmering tapestry below. The scent of jasmine from the overflowing planters battled with the metallic tang of city exhaust. Eleanor, a glass of amber liquid swirling in her hand, watched her adopted daughter. The weight of Isabel's confession pressed down on them both. "It's a lot," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the city. She traced patterns on the stone balustrade, her gaze fixed on the distant skyscrapers. Her usually vibrant eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and a deep, gnawing guilt. Eleanor took a slow sip of her drink, the ice clinking softly in the glass. "Yes, darling, it is, but you did the right thing." Her voice was steady, a reassuring balm against Isabel's turmoil. The years of quiet strength, of bearing the weight of Julian's betrayals, had forged a resilience that shone through her weary eyes. Isabel flinched. "But what if I ruined everything? What if it destroys more than just him?" Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. The burden of her actions was crushing her. Eleanor moved to her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The touch was a silent reassurance, a testament to the unexpected bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "We will face it together, Isabel. We always have. This wasn't your secret alone to bear." Her voice was low, filled with unwavering support. The setting sun cast long shadows across the terrace, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The city lights began to twinkle, a million tiny sparks against the darkening sky. Isabel looked at Eleanor, her expression a mixture of gratitude and fear. I didn't want to hurt anyone else," Isabel confessed, her voice cracking. "But he hurt so many." The realization settled, heavy and bitter, in her chest. Eleanor squeezed her shoulder gently. "He chose that path, darling. His actions are his own responsibility. Your courage, your willingness to face the truth, is a testament to your strength." She paused, taking another slow sip of her drink. "Now we decide how to proceed. We choose our next steps together." The unspoken promise hung between them, a silent vow of support and solidarity against the storm that still raged ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Isabel felt a flicker of hope, a warm ember of strength ignited by her mother's unwavering belief. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than the November rain lashing against the panoramic windows. Julian, usually the picture of imperious control, sat hunched over, the expensive leather of his chair doing little to cushion his defeat. The air thrummed with the silent hum of broken power. His lawyers, usually so confident, shuffled papers, their faces etched with grim resignation. The scent of old money and impending ruin hung heavy in the air. "They're pulling out." His lead counsel, a man whose tailored suit couldn't mask his anxiety, finally said, his voice a low murmur. "All of them, the investors, the partners, even Peterson." Julian didn't react. He stared at the polished table, his reflection a distorted ghost of his former self. The weight of his actions, the years of calculated deceit, finally pressed down with the crushing force of a collapsing empire. The whispers of scandal had become a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. The carefully constructed facade, the image of untouchable success, had shattered into a million pieces. A sharp rap at the door broke the tense silence. His assistant, usually efficient and unflappable, entered, her face pale. "Mr. Thorne, there's a warrant." The words hung in the air, stark and final. Julian lifted his head, his eyes, usually glittering with ambition, now dull and lifeless. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a hollow quiet in the aftermath of the storm. The fight was over. He had lost, and in losing, a strange kind of clarity dawned. The empire he built on lies was gone. But perhaps, in its ruins, something else could begin to grow. Something real. He looked up, at the city sprawling outside the window, a breathtaking vista of glittering lights and dark shadows. He saw not an empire to reclaim, but a life to rebuild. The chilling rain outside felt like a cleansing, washing away the grime of years of deception. The process of rebuilding, he realized, would be long and arduous, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope in the desolate landscape of his ruin. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to walk it, alone. The courtroom was stifling, a suffocating blend of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. Eleanor sat ramrod straight, her composure a fragile mask barely concealing the tremor in her hands. Across the aisle, Julian, gaunt and hollow-eyed, seemed smaller than she remembered, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by a defeated slump. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the weight of years of betrayal hanging heavy between them. Isabel sat beside Eleanor, her youthful face etched with worry. The revelation of her adoption, the subsequent unraveling of her father's life, had aged her beyond her years. She squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent gesture of support. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack that sliced through the tense silence. "Mr. Thorne," the judge's voice boomed, "the court finds you guilty on all counts." Julian didn't flinch. He simply stared ahead, his gaze unfocused, lost in some private torment. The verdict, though expected, felt like a physical blow to Eleanor. It was a validation of her pain, a confirmation of the truth she'd fought so hard to expose, yet it offered little solace. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the wreckage of their lives. "Mother," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the courtroom. "It's over." Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was over, but the healing had only just begun. The legal battle was won, but the emotional war raged on, a silent conflict fought within the confines of their shattered family. The years of deceit, the pain, the betrayal, these were wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But in the quiet understanding that passed between mother and daughter, in the shared grief and the tentative hope, a fragile bridge began to form. A bridge built not on lies and deception, but on the foundation of truth, forgiveness, and a slow, uncertain journey towards healing. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the storm raging within them. But through the downpour, a pale glimmer of sunlight offered a promise of a new dawn. The mahogany of Julian's once imposing study felt cold under Eleanor's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun, slanting through the grimy windows, illuminating the opulent but neglected space. She hadn't set foot here since the trial, a chasm of silence separating her from this gilded cage. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale cigar smoke and forgotten regrets. Isabel stood by the fireplace, her back to Eleanor, staring out at the rain-lashed city. The city that had witnessed Julian's spectacular fall. The city that had devoured him and spat him out. "He's different," Isabel finally said, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. She hadn't visited Julian since his release from prison, a brief, supervised visit mandated by his parole officer. Eleanor turned, her expression unreadable. "Different how?" Isabel shrugged, her shoulders slumping. "Smaller, quieter. His eyes, they're empty." She turned, her gaze locking with Eleanor's. "He apologized, Mother. Not for the lies, not for the hurt, but for taking away your happiness. He said he never understood how much he had." A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm Eleanor. The apology, so hollow yet so utterly unexpected, felt like a phantom limb, the ghost of a man she once knew, a man she'd loved fiercely, blindingly. "He's trying to manipulate you, Isabel," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. The tremor in her hands returned, a persistent reminder of the trauma she was still navigating. Isabel shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No, I think he's finally seeing things clearly. The weight of it all, it's crushing him." Eleanor walked towards her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. The touch was hesitant, unsure. But the years of shared trauma had forged a bond stronger than the lies that had once separated them. He hurt us deeply, Isabel. But forgiveness, it's not about him. It's about us. About healing. She paused, her gaze softening. Are you ready to forgive him? Isabel looked away, her gaze drifting towards the rain-streaked window. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, a fragile beauty amidst the storm. I don't know, Mother. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive him. But maybe I can start to understand. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The rain outside seemed to mirror the storm within. A storm of emotions both devastating and necessary. The path to healing was long and arduous, but in that shared moment of vulnerability, a tentative glimmer of hope pierced the darkness. The courtroom was stifling, a thick miasma of tension and anticipation hanging in the air. Julian, gaunt and pale, sat alone at the defense table, his expensive suit doing little to disguise his defeat. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now dull, reflecting the crumbling edifice of his empire. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing through the silent room. Guilty. The word hung, heavy and final, a death knell to his carefully constructed world. Eleanor watched, a strange calm settling over her. The years of turmoil, the betrayal, the public humiliation, it all culminated in this moment. Yet, there was no triumphant feeling, only a profound sense of closure. The weight of it all, the crushing burden of anger and resentment, had finally lifted. Isabel sat beside Eleanor, her hand clasped tightly in her mother's. The courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows on her face, highlighting the strain of the ordeal. She hadn't expected this level of relief. She'd braced herself for a longer battle, for Julian's endless manipulations. His silence, his acceptance of defeat, was as shocking as the initial revelation at his wedding. Later, outside the courthouse steps, the city noise washed over them, a symphony of car horns, chattering voices, and distant sirens. Eleanor inhaled deeply, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. The sun, weak but persistent, broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow on the pavement. "It's over," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. She looked at Isabel, her eyes searching hers. "It's really over." Isabel nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It is," she replied softly. "But it's also a beginning." She squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their shared resilience. The road ahead would still be challenging. Rebuilding lives, healing wounds, and finding forgiveness would take time. But they would do it together. The weight of their shared past bound them, and even as they moved towards a future free of Julian's tyranny, they would never forget the lessons learned in the shadows of his fall. The echoes of the courtroom's silence still lingered between them, but a new, hopeful murmur of the city's life promised a different kind of future. The judge's pronouncements echoed in the sterile hallways, a stark counterpoint to the hushed whispers of onlookers. Eleanor felt a tremor of something akin to relief, not triumph, but a release from the suffocating pressure of the past year. The crisp autumn air, biting with a chill that seeped into her bones, felt strangely invigorating. Isabel, beside her, shivered, her breath misting in the cold. The weight of their shared burden seemed to lessen with each step away from the courthouse. "It's quiet," Isabel murmured, her voice barely audible above the distant city hum. The city's usual cacophony seemed muted, subdued, mirroring the aftermath of the trial's explosive conclusion. Eleanor nodded, the words catching in her throat. The silence was a stark contrast to the relentless barrage of media attention, the constant scrutiny, the whispers and judgmental stares that had followed them for months. Now, a different kind of silence reigned, the quietude of a life finally freed from Julian's shadow. A shared sigh passed between mother and daughter. The years of turmoil and betrayal had forged an unbreakable bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended the complexities of their relationship. This newfound quietude, though tinged with the lingering scent of heartbreak, allowed space for a different kind of conversation to begin, one built on healing, on acceptance, and on a shared future. "I never imagined it would end like this," Isabel said, her eyes distant, lost in the swirling memories of the past. The weight of her actions, the unintended consequences of her revelation, still weighed heavily on her. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand, her touch conveying a depth of understanding that words couldn't capture. "Neither did I, my dear, but it's over. And now we begin." Her voice, though still frail, held a strength that surprised even her. They paused, standing on the courthouse steps, the city stretching before them, a panorama of possibilities. The weight of the past year remained, a heavy cloak they carried, but in the shared silence, a glimmer of hope emerged, a promise of a future unburdened by Julian's manipulations and lies, a future where forgiveness and healing could finally take root. The mahogany of Julian's once imposing study now felt oppressive, the air thick with the scent of stale cigars and regret. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun, slanting through the grimy windows, illuminating the wreckage of his empire. He sat slumped in his leather chair, the opulent surroundings mocking his current state. The phone lay silent, a stark contrast to the incessant ringing that had once been the soundtrack of his life. A knock, hesitant and soft, broke the silence. Isabel stood in the doorway, her face etched with a weariness that belied her years. She carried a worn photograph, a picture of her as a child, clutched in Eleanor's arms, a radiant smile on her face, blissfully unaware of the storm to come. I wanted to see you," Isabel said, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The crisp autumn air that had earlier felt invigorating now carried a chill that penetrated her very soul. Julian looked up, his eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a dull, haunted quality. He saw the photograph, the youthful innocence staring back at him, a stark reminder of the irreparable damage he had wrought. He swallowed hard, his throat parched, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I understand if you hate me," he finally managed, his voice raspy, the words tumbling out in a rush. The guilt was a crushing weight, pressing down on him with the force of a collapsing building. Isabel stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Hate is a strong word," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within. She placed the photograph gently on his desk. "It's complicated. There's so much I don't understand." Julian nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the photograph. He saw not only a child, but a reflection of his own lost innocence, a stark reminder of the choices that had led him to this desolate point. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. This wasn't just about losing his fortune or his social standing. It was about losing the very essence of who he was. He had played God, manipulating lives, and now he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own deceit. The legal battles were over, but the real battle, the battle for redemption, had just begun. The courtroom's sterile air hung heavy with the finality of the verdict. Eleanor sat, rigid in her tailored suit, the scent of lilies from the small bouquet in her lap a stark contrast to the metallic tang of anxiety clinging to the room. Julian, his face etched with defeat, watched as the judge's gavel fell, a final, resounding thud echoing the collapse of his empire. Isabel stood beside Eleanor, a hand resting reassuringly on her mother's arm. The weight of the past months, the revelations, the betrayals, had aged her, etching lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and soul-searching. Yet, there was a newfound strength in her posture, a quiet resolve that hinted at a hard-won peace. Leaving the courtroom, a biting wind whipped around them, scattering fallen leaves like whispered secrets. The city lights blurred through Eleanor's tear-filled eyes. "It's over," she whispered, the words more a question than a statement. Isabel squeezed her mother's arm. "Yes, Mother, it is." The words were laced with a quiet satisfaction, a sense of closure long deferred. The bitterness had faded, replaced by a weary acceptance. They walked in silence, the city's relentless hum a muffled background to the swirling thoughts in their minds. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a melancholic perfume mirroring the bittersweet ending of a chapter in their lives. Reaching Eleanor's car, Isabel paused. "Thank you, Mother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Eleanor's response was a hug, a long, silent embrace that spoke volumes of unspoken forgiveness and a tentative, fragile hope for the future. As they separated, Eleanor saw in Isabel's eyes not only gratitude, but a profound understanding. An understanding that transcended the pain and betrayal, reaching for a future forged in resilience and the quiet strength of a newly found family. The weight of the past remained, but it no longer defined them. A new dawn, though uncertain, was beginning to break. The legal battle's conclusion hung heavy, a shroud of uncertainty draped over Julian's once impregnable empire. The opulent penthouse, usually a stage for lavish parties, felt eerily silent, the only sound the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock, each chime a hammer blow to Julian's crumbling self-esteem. He stared out at the city, a million glittering lights mocking his diminished power. He'd lost everything, or so it seemed. A knock echoed, sharp and insistent, breaking through his self-imposed isolation. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, entered, his face grim. "The appeal's been denied, Julian. It's final." Julian didn't react, the words sinking into the numbness that had become his constant companion. Davies continued, his voice softer now, laced with a hint of pity. "There's still a possibility, a settlement. Eleanor is willing to negotiate." The name sparked a flicker of something. Not anger, not resentment, but a profound weariness. Eleanor. He thought of her quiet strength in court, her unwavering gaze, a stark contrast to his own desperate flailing. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated everything. "What does she want?" he finally asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "A significant portion of the remaining assets, dedicated to a foundation for at-risk children, and a public apology." Davies paused, watching Julian's reaction. "She also wants to forgive you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Forgiveness, a concept so alien to Julian's world, so far removed from his self-serving ambitions. Yet, in the desolate landscape of his downfall, it offered a fragile, almost imperceptible glimmer of hope. A chance, perhaps, to rebuild not just his empire, but himself. He closed his eyes, the weight of his past, his lies, his betrayals pressing down. The city lights blurred through his tears not of self-pity, but of a dawning understanding. He had destroyed so much, but maybe, just maybe, he could begin to mend what he had broken. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady tick of the clock. Then, in a voice barely audible above the city's hum, Julian spoke. "Tell her, I accept." The admission was a surrender, a confession, a first step on a long, arduous journey towards redemption. The road ahead was uncertain, the path steep, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a flicker of something akin to peace. A beginning. The courtroom's hushed silence felt heavier than the judge's gavel. The air, thick with the scent of old wood and expensive perfume, now carried the faint metallic tang of Julian's defeat. He sat, shoulders slumped, the expensive suit doing little to mask his ravaged appearance. The weight of his lies, the crushing reality of his downfall, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He watched Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her inner strength. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet sadness, a profound understanding of the devastation he'd wrought. Isabel stood beside her, a fragile figure in the storm. The initial turmoil in her eyes had subsided, replaced by a quiet determination. She had chosen her side, not out of blind loyalty but from a deep-seated sense of justice. The weight of the revelation, the tangled threads of her past, had forged a steely resolve within her. The judge's words echoed in the cavernous space. "The settlement is accepted. The funds will be allocated to the Eleanor Vance Foundation for at-risk children." Mr. Thorne is to issue a public apology within the week. The gavel fell, a final, resounding thud that marked the end of an era. As Julian rose, his legs unsteady, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, a sea of murmuring voices that blended into a chaotic symphony of judgment and speculation. He caught Eleanor's eye. Her gaze held none of the vitriol he expected, only a quiet sorrow. He saw a flicker of something else, too, forgiveness. It was a fragile thing, a delicate bloom amidst the ruins of his life, but it was there. Later, in the sterile quiet of his lawyer's office, Julian stared at the cityscape through the rain-streaked window. The city lights, once symbols of his power and success, now seemed distant and cold. He'd lost his empire, his reputation, even the hollow facade of his carefully constructed persona. But somewhere, amidst the wreckage, he felt a fragile seed of hope taking root. The road ahead was long and arduous, the path to redemption paved with regret and self-reflection. But the first step had been taken. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain, felt less heavy now, less like a sentence and more like a quiet beginning. The apology wouldn't be easy. Neither would rebuilding his life, brick by painful brick. But he would start. He had to. The stale air of the holding cell tasted of despair. Julian, stripped of his tailored suits and polished shoes, sat hunched on a metal cot, the cheap mattress offering no comfort. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a relentless counterpoint to the gnawing emptiness in his gut. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the remnants of champagne wishes and caviar dreams clinging to him like a shroud. He ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair, the gesture revealing the stark reality of his downfall. His reflection in the grimy windowpane showed a man broken, the arrogance erased, replaced by a haunted weariness. A guard's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, a jarring interruption to the silence. The door clanged open, revealing Eleanor. She was different somehow. The controlled fury he remembered was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity that both intimidated and moved him. She carried herself with a strength he'd never truly appreciated, a resilience forged in the crucible of his betrayal. "Julian," she said, her voice soft but firm, devoid of the theatrics he'd expected. She didn't approach him, remaining a respectful distance. "I came to see you." He looked up, surprised. He had anticipated scorn, anger, perhaps even a hint of schadenfreude. But her expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of composure that concealed a depth of emotion he couldn't decipher. I didn't expect," he stammered, his voice rough with disuse. "No," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I suppose not. But I wanted to understand, to try and find some semblance of closure." She paused, a faint tremor in her voice betraying her carefully constructed composure. "For Isabel, for myself." He watched her, the silence stretching between them, filled only with the distant hum of the building and the relentless drip of a leaky faucet. The city outside, a glittering tapestry of lights, felt a million miles away. He saw the faint lines etched around her eyes, the subtle softening of her jawline, evidence of the toll his actions had taken. It wasn't just his life that lay in ruins. She too bore the scars of his deceit. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. The apology felt hollow, insufficient, a pathetic offering in the face of his transgressions. Yet it was a beginning, a fragile, hesitant step toward the long, arduous journey of redemption that lay ahead. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. But in Eleanor's quiet presence, in the unexpected compassion in her eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope, however faint. A chance, perhaps, for a different kind of beginning. The metallic tang of the jail food clung to Julian's tongue, a bitter reminder of his fallen status. He watched Eleanor through the smeared plexiglass, her presence a stark contrast to the sterile environment. The fluorescent lights, harsh and unforgiving, seemed to amplify the lines etched around her eyes, a testament to the emotional turmoil she'd endured. He saw a strength in her posture, a quiet dignity that belied the devastation he'd caused. I didn't expect this, he mumbled, his voice raspy. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of his betrayal. Eleanor remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The faint scent of her perfume, a familiar comfort from a life irrevocably altered, reached him across the table. I came for Isabel, she said, her voice low, steady. And for myself, to understand. He saw a flicker of something, sadness, in her eyes. The carefully constructed wall of composure showed a crack. The weight of his actions pressed upon him, suffocating. He'd envisioned her rage, her bitter condemnation. This quiet acceptance was far more devastating. It spoke of a profound loss, a dismantling of a life built on shared dreams, now shattered beyond repair. I never meant, he trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The apology felt hollow, a cheap imitation of remorse. He'd spent weeks crafting excuses, building justifications in his mind. They crumbled now, facing her quiet strength. You meant to build an empire on lies, Eleanor corrected, her voice still soft but edged with steel. The coldness in her tone cut through him, sharper than any shouted accusation. You built a life on deceit, and you nearly destroyed everything I held dear. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Outside, the city thrummed with life, a stark contrast to the bleakness of the room. He saw a reflection of his own ruin in her calm eyes, not triumph, but a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. A guard cleared his throat, interrupting the tense silence. The time was up. Eleanor stood, her movements graceful, her demeanor unyielding. She paused at the door, turning back to him one last time. Justice will be served, Julian, she said, her voice carrying a hint of sorrow. But true redemption, that's something you'll have to earn. The door clanged shut, leaving him alone with the chilling silence and the crushing weight of his own actions. The beginning of his redemption wouldn't be easy. He had to grapple with the reality that the empire he'd built on lies was nothing, but rebuilding a life grounded in truth would be a journey far longer and far harder than he ever anticipated. The courtroom was a stifling box of polished wood and hushed whispers. Julian, gaunt and pale, sat alone at the defendant's table, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The scent of expensive cologne, usually a shield, offered no comfort now. It only served to amplify his discomfort, a stark reminder of the life he'd lost. He watched as Eleanor, composed yet fragile, took the stand. The crisp white of her blouse seemed to illuminate the shadows beneath her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights and the relentless toll of the past months. Her testimony was measured, each word carefully chosen, devoid of melodrama. She spoke of the initial shock, the gut-wrenching betrayal, not with fiery anger, but with a quiet dignity that was far more devastating. The quiet strength in her voice was almost unbearable for Julian to witness. He saw the pain reflected in her eyes, the immense sadness that mirrored his own, though his was born of guilt, hers of a profound loss of trust. The judge's gavel, sharp and decisive, punctuated the silences. Each bang was a hammer blow against the remnants of Julian's self-worth. He flinched at every sound, each one a stark reminder of the impending sentence, not just legal but personal. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, a life he was now permanently excluded from. The final verdict came as no surprise. Guilty on all counts. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a dark cloud swallowing Julian whole. He didn't flinch. He'd already accepted his fate. The weight of his actions had already crushed him far more than any judge's sentence ever could. As the bailiff led him away, he caught Eleanor's gaze one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sadness. A sadness that held a hint of forgiveness, but also a firm resolve. A promise of rebuilding her life, independent of him and his broken world. The clanging of the cell door echoed the finality of his fall, the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards a redemption that seemed both impossible and utterly necessary. The crisp autumn air bit at Eleanor's cheeks as she walked through Central Park, the fallen leaves crunching beneath her boots, a counterpoint to the turmoil within. The legal battles were over, the dust settling on Julian's shattered empire. A strange quiet had descended, a stark contrast to the media frenzy that had consumed her life for months. She breathed deeply, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling her lungs, a grounding fragrance after the suffocating perfume of wealth and betrayal. She found a bench overlooking the Bethesda terrace, the cascading water a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She wasn't sure what she felt anymore: relief, yes, but also a profound emptiness. The woman she'd been, the wife of a billionaire, was gone, a phantom limb aching in its absence. But a new self was emerging, stronger, more resolute. Her phone vibrated, a text from Isabel. "Thinking of you. Want to grab coffee tomorrow?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Isabel, once a symbol of her husband's deceit, was now a beacon of unexpected hope. They were rebuilding their relationship, slowly, painstakingly, brick by brick. The adoption papers, a relic of a life she couldn't quite comprehend anymore, lay locked away, a physical manifestation of a past she was actively leaving behind. The thought of facing Isabel, of navigating the complexities of their new, undefined relationship, filled her with a nervous energy. Yet, underneath that apprehension, a deep sense of peace resided. Forgiveness wasn't a magical erasure of the past. It was an active choice, a conscious decision to release the bitterness that threatened to consume her. She typed a reply, "Coffee sounds perfect. Tomorrow at 11. As she sent the message, a robin landed on the bench beside her, its bright red breast a splash of color against the muted autumn hues. It chirped softly, a tiny sound that seemed to carry the promise of a new dawn, a new chapter, a new life. Isabel's apartment hummed with the low thrum of city life, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway, the incessant chatter of unseen neighbors. Sunlight, filtered through the rain-streaked windows, painted pale stripes across her minimalist living room. She paced, restless energy a tangible thing. The phone call with her mother still echoed in her ears. Eleanor's quiet strength a stark contrast to the tempest that had raged within Isabel just weeks ago. She stopped, running a hand through her hair, the strands catching on the delicate gold chain she hadn't removed since the scandal broke. It felt heavy, a constant reminder of her tangled past. The weight of her actions, the unraveling of Julian's empire, pressed down on her. She'd chosen to protect others, but at what cost? A knock on the door startled her. It was Liam, her lawyer, a kind man with perpetually tired eyes who'd become a surprising source of comfort during this ordeal. "Isabel?" he said, his voice soft. He carried a worn leather briefcase. "Liam, come in." He sat heavily on the sofa, the springs groaning beneath his weight. He opened the briefcase, revealing a thick file. "The final settlement details," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Julian, he's agreed." Isabel stared at the document, a wave of nausea washing over her. Julian's signature, scrawled across the page, felt like a physical violation. It represented the culmination of months of turmoil, the shattering of a life she'd never truly known. "He's giving up everything?" she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. Liam nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the weight of the decision. "He's accepting the consequences. It's not just the legal ramifications, Isabel. He's changed." A silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant city sounds. The sheer scale of Julian's downfall was almost incomprehensible, a seismic shift that had reshaped not only their lives but the lives of countless others. Isabel felt a pang of something akin to pity. It was a complex emotion, a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, guilt and a fragile hope. This wasn't the victory she'd imagined. Felt incomplete. The fight was over, but the scars remained, a roadmap of a journey she was still struggling to understand. The crisp autumn air bit at Isabel's cheeks as she walked through Central Park, the fallen leaves crunching under her boots. A melancholic beauty clung to the scene, mirroring the bittersweet ache in her heart. Liam's words echoed, "He's changed." Could Julian truly have changed? The image of his defeated signature, etched onto the settlement papers, flickered in her mind. She hadn't felt triumphant, only a hollow echo of resolution. She found a quiet bench overlooking a reflecting pond, the still water mirroring a pale, overcast sky. She pulled out a worn photograph from her purse, a faded picture of her as a child, clutching Eleanor's hand. A smile played on the child's lips, a smile that felt distant, almost belonging to a stranger. She'd spent so long trying to define herself against Julian's shadow, against the life he'd built for her, that she barely recognized the girl in the photograph. A rustle broke her reverie. Eleanor stood before her, a small, hesitant smile playing on her lips. The park felt right, Eleanor said, her voice soft, tinged with a familiar understanding. She sat beside Isabel, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken empathy. I saw the papers, Eleanor said after a while, her gaze distant. I don't know what to feel. Isabel nodded, understanding perfectly. Me neither. It's anticlimactic. He's lost everything, Eleanor murmured, her eyes welling up. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. But I still feel something. It wasn't anger, Isabel noticed. It was something deeper, heavier, a residue of their shared history. Grief, Isabel offered softly. Eleanor considered that, a slow nod acknowledging the truth. Grief for what we thought we had. Grief for the life that was stolen. A gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves, carrying with it a faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Isabel placed a comforting hand on Eleanor's arm. The weight of the past, the turmoil, the devastation, it hadn't vanished. But in the quiet beauty of the park, amidst the shifting colors of autumn, a new kind of understanding blossomed. A shared understanding, built on the ashes of what had been, a foundation for something new. The fight was over, yes, but the rebuilding had just begun. The future, though uncertain, felt less daunting, lighter somehow. The sprawling penthouse, once a symbol of Julian's unchecked ambition, felt eerily silent. Dust motes danced in the weak winter sunlight slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the emptiness. Eleanor stood by the window, the city a blurred tapestry below. The crisp air bit at her cheeks, a familiar sting mirroring the coldness that had settled in her heart. It wasn't the physical loss, the vast fortune gone, that chilled her most. It was the loss of the life she'd imagined, the future she'd painstakingly built. A soft knock echoed through the vast space. Isabel entered, her face pale but resolute. She carried a small, worn leather-bound book, Eleanor's journal from their early years together. I found this, Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the library, amongst all the things he tried to hide. Eleanor turned, her eyes lingering on the book. The scent of old paper and dried ink filled the air, a tangible link to a past she'd tried so hard to bury. She took the journal, her fingers tracing the embossed initials, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He never truly understood, Eleanor murmured, turning the worn pages. He thought he could control everything, even time itself. He couldn't even grasp the depth of his own selfishness. Isabel approached, her gaze softening as she watched Eleanor. He's changed, Mom. I've seen it. The anger is gone, replaced with regret. Regret, Eleanor repeated, a hint of disbelief coloring her voice. The word felt too small, too inadequate to encompass the devastation Julian had wrought. Regret doesn't undo the pain, Isabel. It doesn't bring back the years, the trust, the life he stole. Isabel nodded, her eyes welling up. I know, but maybe it's a starting point, a chance for him, for all of us, to begin to heal. Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the past pressing down on her. The journal lay open in her hands, a testament to a life lived, a life irrevocably altered. She looked at Isabel, her daughter, the woman she'd given up, the woman who now stood beside her, not as an enemy, but as a reluctant ally in the difficult work of rebuilding their lives. A new kind of understanding passed between them, fragile yet strong, born from shared trauma and the slow, painful process of forgiveness. The future remained uncertain, shadowed by the ghosts of the past. But in the shared silence, in the simple act of sharing a memory held within the pages of a worn journal, a glimmer of hope flickered. The muted chime of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway announced another hour bled away. Julian sat in the sparsely furnished guest room of the halfway house, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a second skin. He stared at his reflection in the cheap, cracked mirror, a stranger gazing back, eyes hollowed, cheeks gaunt. His tailored suits were replaced by a simple, ill-fitting gray shirt. The once impeccable Julian Thorne was a ruin. He picked up a worn photograph, a younger Eleanor, her smile radiant, holding a baby Isabel. The picture felt heavier than it should, a physical manifestation of his guilt. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. A hesitant knock preceded Isabel's entrance. She stood in the doorway, her posture hesitant, yet her eyes held a quiet strength he hadn't seen before. The sharp lines of anger and resentment that had etched themselves onto her face during the trial had softened. A tentative hope flickered within him. "They're letting you out early," Isabel stated, her voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't offer a greeting, a hug, nothing but the stark observation. He nodded, his voice a dry rasp. Good behavior, apparently. The irony wasn't lost on him. Good behavior after a lifetime of bad. Isabel stepped closer, her gaze lingering on the photograph. "She's beautiful. She always was." The words were a sigh, heavy with regret, and strong, stronger than I ever gave her credit for. He looked up, meeting Isabel's gaze. I never understood her." Isabel remained silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Neither did I, not fully. But seeing her move on, seeing her find strength, it made me see things differently. About both of you. About me." She picked up a discarded newspaper clipping detailing Eleanor's philanthropic work. "She's helping others now, building something new." Julian closed his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I destroyed everything," he whispered, the words barely audible. Isabel's hand rested lightly on his arm. "Maybe not everything," she countered, her voice soft yet firm. "Maybe there's still a chance to build something. Not what you had, maybe something else, something better." He looked at her, at the unexpected compassion in her eyes, and a flicker of hope ignited in the desolate landscape of his soul. It was a fragile ember, easily extinguished, yet it was there, a testament to the possibility of redemption. The road ahead was long and arduous, filled with the echoes of his past misdeeds. But for the first time in a long time, Julian Thorne felt a sliver of something other than despair. A fragile beginning. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and fallen leaves, did little to soothe Julian's frayed nerves. He sat on a park bench, the cold seeping into his bones, a stark contrast to the opulent comfort he once knew. The city skyline, a glittering monument to his former success, felt distant, alien. He watched children chase pigeons, their laughter a jarring reminder of the joy he'd systematically destroyed. A crumpled tissue, stained with the residue of his tears, lay forgotten beside him. He hadn't cried this much since the wedding debacle, a flood of remorse threatening to drown him. Isabel's words echoed in his ears. "Maybe there's still a chance to build something better." The something better felt like a mythical creature, a creature he wasn't sure he deserved. His phone vibrated, the jarring sound piercing the quiet contemplation. It was Eleanor. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He hadn't spoken to her since the trial. He finally answered. Eleanor's voice, though measured, carried a hint of weariness. "Julian," she began, the name sounding unfamiliar, almost foreign on her tongue. "There's a meeting at the foundation. Isabel. She wants you there." A meeting. The Eleanor Thorne Foundation. He hadn't even known she'd started one. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rustle of leaves. I don't know," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't think I'm ready." "Ready for what, Julian?" Her voice softened slightly, a flicker of something akin to compassion in its tone. "Ready to face your past? Or ready to accept a future where you might, just might, try to make amends?" The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. He stared at his hands, calloused and unfamiliar. He pictured Isabel's face, the tentative hope, the surprising compassion. He thought of the children in the park, their uninhibited joy. Maybe redemption wasn't a mythical creature after all. Maybe it was a slow, painful process, a step at a time. "Tell me where to be," he finally said. The words a promise, a fragile beginning. The cold no longer felt so biting. The city lights, once a symbol of his lost empire, seemed to shimmer with a faint, hopeful glow. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt the weight of his guilt lift slightly, replaced by a hesitant, but persistent, ember of hope. The mahogany table in Eleanor's foundation office felt strangely cold beneath Julian's hands. He'd arrived, driven by a compulsion he couldn't quite name, a fragile hope clinging to the edges of his despair. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical smell of the hospital where he'd spent his last few weeks recovering from a mental and emotional breakdown. Isabel sat opposite him, her expression unreadable. "He's different," Isabel said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the tense silence. She spoke of Julian, but her gaze was fixed on Eleanor, who sat observing them both with a careful neutrality. Eleanor sighed, the sound barely audible above the hum of the city outside. "Different how, Isabel?" Isabel hesitated, quieter, more aware. She picked at a loose thread on the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "He seems to understand the gravity of what he did." Julian flinched at the words, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He'd spent weeks wrestling with the wreckage of his life, the shattered remnants of his empire, the gaping hole where his arrogance once resided. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes holding a depth of sadness that mirrored his own. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. "He called me mother," Eleanor said, the words surprising them both. It had been years since Julian had called her mother in genuine affection. He wanted to know how to help. He finally contacted the families affected by his unethical practices. He is finally trying to rectify his mistakes. The quiet acknowledgement hanging between them was more powerful than any shouted accusation. The air, thick with unspoken emotions, began to clear. There was no sudden burst of reconciliation, no easy forgiveness, but there was a tentative understanding, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of betrayal. A tentative but undeniably hopeful start. The sound of the city outside, previously overwhelming, now felt like a comforting backdrop to this fragile peace. It was a beginning, not an ending. The future remained uncertain, yet a sense of possibility, however faint, now filled the room. Julian felt a tear roll down his cheek, this time not a tear of self-pity, but of weary hope. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and decaying leaves, bit at Julian's exposed skin as he walked the grounds of the rehabilitation center. His tailored suits had been replaced by simple, comfortable clothes, the expensive fabrics swapped for soft cotton. The manicured lawns of his former life felt alien now, the meticulous order a stark contrast to the chaotic mess of his inner world. He'd spent weeks here, wrestling with the ghosts of his past, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with crushing intensity. He stopped by a gnarled oak, its branches reaching towards the bruised, twilight sky. The setting sun cast long shadows, stretching and distorting the familiar landscape. He ran a hand over the rough bark, the texture grounding him in the present. He wasn't the man he once was, the billionaire who believed himself invincible. That man had crumbled under the weight of his own deceit. A soft rustle broke the silence. Isabel emerged from the path, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. She carried a worn book, its cover faded and dog-eared. "You look peaceful," she said, her voice hesitant, the words tinged with a surprising note of compassion. He managed a small smile, a fragile thing born of exhaustion and a tentative hope. Peaceful isn't a word I'd associate with myself lately, he admitted, his voice raspy from disuse. But calmer, perhaps. They sat beneath the oak, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken understanding. The leaves crunched under the weight of their feet. The air was chilly, yet a warmth, born not of the sun but of a shared experience of pain and the nascent possibility of redemption, settled between them. "I've been reading," Isabel said, breaking the silence, her gaze fixed on the swirling leaves, "about forgiveness, about the long road to repairing the damage." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "It's a daunting task." Julian nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. The sun had dipped below the line, leaving only a faint blush of color in the sky. "It is," he agreed, his voice low, "but it's a task I intend to face. For myself, yes, but also for you, for Eleanor, for everyone I've hurt." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. He had come to terms with the depth of his failings, the extent of the damage he had inflicted. He was beginning to see a way forward, a path that didn't lead to power and dominion but to self-worth earned through amends. The night was settling in, a quiet blanket over the land, mirroring the quiet acceptance he was beginning to feel within himself. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as Eleanor and Isabel walked along the wooded trail. The late afternoon sun, filtering through the canopy, dappled the path in shifting patterns of light and shadow. A comfortable silence settled between them, a stark contrast to the storm that had ravaged their lives. Eleanor, her face softened by a newfound peace, smiled faintly. "Remember that old oak tree near the rehabilitation center?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isabel nodded, the memory of that somber meeting with Julian vivid in her mind. "I do." Felt symbolic somehow. Symbolic of what? Eleanor asked, her eyes questioning. Isabel hesitated. Of the weight of the past, the slow, difficult process of growth, of finding redemption even in the darkest of places. They walked in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves under their boots a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping of unseen birds. The air, crisp and clean, seemed to wash away the lingering bitterness of the past. Eleanor stopped, turning to face Isabel. "You know," she said, her voice filled with a quiet warmth, "I never imagined our family would look like this. Broken, reformed, different." Isabel met her gaze, a flicker of unshed tears in her eyes. "Me neither, Mom. But maybe this is better. Real, authentic." She squeezed her mother's hand, the gesture filled with a depth of affection that transcended words. A small, hesitant smile played on Eleanor's lips. "I think you're right, my dear. We've endured so much and we're stronger for it. We've found a new kind of family, a new kind of strength. One built on understanding and forgiveness." She paused, looking out at the sprawling landscape. "And that's a pretty beautiful thing, isn't it?" A genuine smile spread across her face, reflecting the quiet triumph that had settled over her. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the warm, hopeful glow that had finally settled in their hearts. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel threatening. It felt possible. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with the scent of old wood and stale coffee. Julian, gaunt and pale, sat alone, the weight of his empire now crumbling like ancient ruins, pressing down on him. He watched Eleanor, her presence radiating a quiet strength that surprised even him. The settlement had been reached, a brutal compromise that stripped him of most of his wealth but spared him prison. He'd lost everything, yet a strange sense of calm settled over him. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage of his life, but also, unexpectedly, a sliver of clarity. Isabel sat beside Eleanor, her hand resting reassuringly on her mother's arm. The tension that had once knotted her brow had eased, replaced by a thoughtful serenity. She testified, her voice shaking at first, but gaining strength as she spoke of her own struggle, her initial resentment giving way to a hard-won understanding. The truth, however painful, had set her free. The judge's gavel fell, a final, resounding thud that echoed the collapse of Julian's carefully constructed world. He watched as Eleanor and Isabel left, their backs straight, their steps sure. He felt a pang of regret, a sharp, unfamiliar stab of remorse that transcended self-pity. He had hurt them deeply, irrevocably. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the loss of money, power, or reputation. It was the shattering of trust, the betrayal of love. Later, in the sterile confines of his sparsely furnished apartment, the silence pressed in on him. He stared out the window at the city lights, a glittering panorama of a life he no longer recognized. He picked up a framed photograph, Eleanor and a younger Isabel, both laughing, their faces radiant with a joy he had callously destroyed. A tear escaped, tracing a lonely path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of self-pity, but of profound sorrow. He had lost everything, but in that loss, perhaps, lay the possibility of something new, something real. A foundation built not on power and manipulation, but on genuine remorse and the arduous path towards redemption. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The weight of his past remained, a heavy burden to bear, but it was no longer crushing him. He was ready to begin. The rebuilding wouldn't be easy, but he would face it, not with arrogance, but with a humbling sense of responsibility. He would find his own way to make amends. The crisp autumn air bit at Eleanor's cheeks as she walked through Central Park, the fallen leaves crunching under her boots. A bittersweet peace settled over her. The legal battles were over, the wreckage of her marriage cleared away. She'd found a small apartment overlooking the park, a world away from the gilded cage of her former life. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She missed Isabel but understood the need for space, for Isabel to forge her own path. That evening, a hesitant knock came on her door. It was Isabel. Her face, once etched with confusion and guilt, now held a tentative hope. "Mom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to see you." Eleanor pulled her into a warm embrace. The scent of autumn leaves and Isabel's familiar perfume filled the small apartment. "Come in, sweetheart. How are you?" Isabel sank onto the sofa, her hands twisting in her lap. "I'm better. It's just, I keep thinking about Dad." A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "He's hurting, Isabel," Eleanor said gently, "but he has to face the consequences of his actions. It's a long road, but he has to find his own way." "I feel responsible," Isabel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "If I hadn't," Eleanor interrupted softly. "You did what you thought was right at a time when you were in terrible pain. There is no blame here, only understanding. We both suffered, but we're finding our way now." Isabel nodded, the weight of her confession easing. She looked around the small but cozy apartment, the soft glow of the lamplight casting a warm aura. "It's peaceful here, Mom. Different." Eleanor smiled. "It is. A new beginning. For both of us." She reached out, taking Isabel's hand. The warmth of their touch, the shared silence, spoke volumes of healing. A fragile but promising connection rebuilt on honesty and understanding. The city lights twinkled outside, casting a hopeful glow on their quiet reconciliation. The start of a new chapter in their complex story. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they faced it together. The courtroom's sterile air hung heavy with the weight of finality. Julian, gaunt and defeated, sat alone, the remnants of his empire reduced to ashes around him. The judge's gavel, a final, sharp crack, echoed the shattering of his meticulously constructed world. He'd lost everything: the fortune, the power, the illusion of invincibility. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a suffocating shroud. Days bled into weeks. The opulent penthouse lay empty, a monument to his downfall. Julian found himself in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, the silence a stark contrast to the constant buzz of his former life. He stared out at the city lights, a cold indifference replacing his usual arrogance. The glittering cityscape mocked him, a reminder of everything he'd lost. He picked up a worn photograph, a faded image of a younger Eleanor, her eyes shining with a love he had so carelessly squandered. Regret, sharp and bitter, clawed at him. He'd lost not just his empire, but the woman who had loved him unconditionally. One afternoon, a hesitant knock on his door. It was Isabel. She stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something akin to forgiveness. I wanted to see you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the silence. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Come in, Isabel." She stepped inside, her presence filling the small space with a strange mix of quiet strength and fragility. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of a cheap clock on the wall. The scent of rain, carried in on a gust of wind, filled the room, a poignant reminder of how much had changed. Finally, Isabel spoke. I'm sorry, Dad," she said, the words heavy with emotion. The apology wasn't for the revelation, but for the pain she'd inadvertently caused. Julian looked at his daughter, at the woman she had become, a woman shaped by his betrayal. He reached out, his hand trembling, and covered hers. "I deserve your anger, Isabel. I've done things I can't undo, but I'm trying to change." The words felt inadequate, but they were honest. The raw vulnerability in his voice surprised both of them. It was a start, a tentative beginning to a long, arduous process of rebuilding what he had destroyed, not just his life, but the lives of those he claimed to love. He knew redemption wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to atone for his mistakes, to finally learn the true meaning of family. The muted sunlight filtering through the tall windows of a community center cast long shadows across the room. Julian, dressed in simple clothes, sat stiffly at a small table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes and cigars that once defined his world. He was volunteering, sorting donations, a far cry from boardroom battles and million-dollar deals. He was learning the quiet dignity of simple tasks, the satisfaction of helping those less fortunate. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. A soft knock startled him. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her eyes, once filled with hurt and anger, now held a quiet strength. She carried a tray laden with mugs. "Coffee?" she offered, her voice gentle. He nodded, the simple gesture a testament to the shift in their relationship. The bitter taste of the coffee was a mirror to the past, but he accepted it, a small act of acceptance. "Isabel called," Eleanor said, her gaze lingering on him.